Chapter 478. This was the first time in Fan Xian's 3 years in the capital that he had planned something on his own. He didn't have the help of the old men or Yin Bingyun's plans. However, he could still use the Overwatch Council's enormous intelligence network and the enormous files and resources accumulated over the years to begin extending the tentacles of a conspiracy from outside the royal palace into the royal palace. The pressure was great, but he had to learn to endure it. In the process of preparing for this matter, it wasn't that he hadn't considered telling the truth to his father and Chen Pingping. However, the thoughts of these two elders were truly difficult to fathom. No one knew how loyal they were to the emperor. He also didn't know whether or not such a conspiracy that would throw the royal family into chaos would be forcefully suppressed by these two elders for some reason. Thus, he chose to move forward in the dark alone. The Overwatch Council's intelligence reports flowed endlessly into his study. In order to avoid drawing the attention of those with ulterior motives, Fan Xian used an ingenious name. He only carefully touched on the information on the outside. Then, it passed through a few hands and was delivered to a remote and quiet courtyard in the middle of the city. He didn't dare to be silent for too long in the study and reveal any traces. As usual, he was filial to his father and wandered freely in the garden. Along the way, he even went to Xianqiwu's manor to be a guest. However, this year, Xianqiwu did not invite him as he had in the past. Fan Xian knew that Xianqiwu was, after all, close to the crown prince. At this juncture, when the crown prince was gradually waking from his silence and using his good performance to fool everyone in the palace, Xianqiwu must have received the Eastern Palace's signal and no longer tried to rope him in. However, this change was not sudden. Xianqiwu found a good excuse and personally went to the manor to deliver a generous gift. After a few days, Fan Xian finally thought through this matter from beginning to end. After going through the plan in his mind, he stood in the position of an investigator and used a cautious gaze to examine the clues in his mind. He confirmed that the royal family's investigation from top to bottom would not involve Hongzhu and would not implicate him. Only then did he feel slightly more relaxed. On the 7th day of the new year, Fan Xizha, who had been cooped up in the manor, pestered his brother to go out for a walk. Fan Xian glared at him and retorted, "You think you're still the second young master of Fan Manor? Right now, it is the council that is hiding your whereabouts. But I am sure that the palace already knows where you are. Right now, no one from the Ministry of Justice has come to arrest you, because the palace is giving face to father and me. If you go out with such a fat face to show off, where will the palace put its face? Someone will be coming to arrest you soon." Fan Xizha was surprised. Why was his brother speaking so harshly today? But in the year he had been working in Northern Qi, he still retained the sinister business genius of the past. He had also shed some of his pompous air. He immediately saw that his brother had something on his mind. His mood was heavy. Carefully he asked, "Brother, what happened? We are brothers in this world. Tell me what you want and see if I can help you." Fan Xian suddenly thought of the Northern Qi aces who had followed Fan Xizha south and were now arranged to live in the country estate outside the city. His heart jumped, but he immediately cast aside those thoughts. He didn't even dare to disturb Director Chen and his father, let alone his precious younger brother. It was just that Xizha had seen through his thoughts, so he had to cover it up. He paused slightly and then said, "On the 10th day, the Great Prince's Manor will open its doors to welcome guests. I will also be going." "The 10th day?" Fan Xizha pressed his lips together and giggled. "Brother, that is an important day. It looks like the Great Prince truly thinks highly of you to actually pick such a day to invite you." Fan Xian laughed coldly. "I'm afraid this is Wang Fei's intention. What am I worried about? I said I was going to take Hongsheng, but yesterday, someone from the manor came to remind me that on the 10th day, our second prince will also be going." Fan Xizha sucked in a cold breath. "Good heavens! Brother, you beat the second prince into a pile of mud, and now you're going to sit at the same table to eat. Be careful of that woman's dirty tricks." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "Not necessarily. Who would dare to kill someone in the Great Prince's manor? It's just, I feel it will be difficult to deal with." Fan Xizha lowered his head and immediately understood what his brother was worried about. The great prince had chosen the 10th day to invite guests, and it was Fan Xian and the second prince. Presumably, the great prince still wanted his two brothers to be at peace again. His brother couldn't not give face to the great prince, but he couldn't let go of the second prince. No wonder he was in such a difficult situation. He thought he understood the reason for his brother's heavy thoughts. He shook his head and said, "If you want to eat, then eat. In any case, if you don't say anything, the great prince can't do anything to you." Fan Xian smiled. "That's true." He looked at his brother and suddenly said, "Are we really going out? We can't get out of the carriage. We can only watch from the carriage." Fan Xizha was overjoyed and looked at him pitifully. After returning from northern Qi, he had been locked up in the manor. Even during the ancestral worship on the first day of the new year, he could only kowtow a few times in the carriage. He had long been stifled. Hearing his brother's orders, he nodded repeatedly. As the carriage traveled through Jingdo, snowflakes gently floated down like willow catkins. The Fan brothers strolled around the bustling streets of Jingdo twice. In the middle, they stopped by Dombo bookstore to understand the recent situation. The two owners had arrived. The shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall, who had replaced Seventh Yi, quickly entered the carriage to report. However, listening to the report was secondary. Fan Xizha only wanted to see the small bookstore he had started. After leaving Dombo bookstore, they went to Baoyue brothel. The carriage stopped outside the hidden back door of Baoyue brothel. Fan Xizha tilted his head and looked at the 3-story building. His young face was full of the sigh of an old man. Earlier, looking at Dombo bookstore had already made him feel emotional. Now looking at the brothel that had changed his life, the complicated feelings in his mind suddenly surged. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage and walked out. Fan Xizha was overjoyed. Without saying anything, he followed him out of the carriage. There was already someone waiting at the back door. The group of people quietly entered the back courtyard and followed the quiet stairs directly up to the 3rd floor. They sat in the room that had been empty the whole time. Fan Xizha excitedly twisted his head and looked around. Occasionally, his palm would touch the antique furniture that he had personally arranged in the style of the Wei Kingdom. His face was full of reluctance and excitement. Fan Xian smiled and glanced at him. He was not worried about his brother's safety. In Jingdo, as long as he came out with him, no one would dare to force him to do anything. However, looking at Fan Xizha's expression, his emotions suddenly stirred. For people like Xizha and the 3rd prince, if they were to be judged as good or evil, they were probably characters that should be cut 1,000 times. Yet, he had always stood firmly behind them. He laughed at himself and thought to himself that he really was not a good person. There was no one else in the side room. Only Sang-Wen and Shi Qing'er were personally serving him. After drinking a cup of hot tea, Fan Xian gave Sang-Wen a meaningful glance. The two of them walked into the hidden secret room in the back. Fan Xizha was not surprised. He didn't even glance at the two of them. He only continued to chat with Shi Qing'er. Between the lines, he was very concerned about the state of Baoyue brothel's operations after he left the Qing kingdom. After he heard Shi Qing'er relay Fan Xian's slight changes to Baoyue brothel, as well as the situation of the girls' contracts, he opened his mouth wide and sucked in a cold breath. His gaze toward the secret room became different. Fan Xizha truly admired his brother from the bottom of his heart. With these changes, it looked like the brothel had taken a loss. In reality, he had won the hearts of the people and reduced a lot of unnecessary expenses in the dark. He shook his chubby face and secretly sighed in admiration. "I only know how to earn silver, but my brother knows how to win the hearts of the people." What Fan Xian wanted was the loyalty of his subordinates. Other than sucking in the silver of the nobles, the most important use of Baoyue brothel was to gather intelligence. This kind of work could only be handled by Sang-Wen, who was loyal to him. "Have you been to Qin Garden recently?" Fan Xian looked at the gentlewoman and seemed to ask casually. Sang-Wen shook her head. "No." Fan Xian nodded. Sang-Wen was his direct subordinate. As long as the old Qin cripple didn't say anything, the rules of the council and corresponding workflow would not be able to interfere with her actions. "How is the preparation of the things I want coming along?" Sangwon took out a sealed craft paper bag and handed it over. The intelligence regarding the embroidery bureau is very easy to obtain. However, the matter you want to investigate is not easy to start with. She forced a smile and said, "The medical officials of the Imperial Academy of Medicine are all old men. Why would they go to a brothel? If you really want to investigate the Imperial Academy of Medicine, I think it would be more convenient to start with the council." Fan Xian shook his head and said, "I said earlier that this is a private matter. It cannot go through the council. Also, the imperial doctors are all old men. But what about their disciples? They are all young people." Sangwon's lips were a bit wide, but they were not ugly. On the contrary, they contrasted with her gentle face and gave off a different feeling. She opened her mouth and bitterly said, "The salary of the students of the Imperial Academy of Medicine is too little. Before they finish their apprenticeship, they cannot diagnose on their own. Even the manners in Jingdo are not allowed to go. It is truly difficult to get them to come to Baiwa brothel." Fan Xian took out the file from the craft paper bag and narrowed his eyes to look at it closely. Relying on his extraordinary memory, he forcefully memorized most of the key contents on the file and handed it back. Sangwon took out a brass basin and carefully burned the file and the craft paper bag in it. She only stood after she had burned everything to ashes. Fan Xian digested the intelligence in his head and closed his eyes. He shook his head and said, "You will stop here." Sangwon bowed slightly and said, "Yes." Fan Xian took his brother and left Baiwa brothel. However, he did not stay in the manor. After sending Sija back, he once again sat in the black carriage. He thought in the carriage, regardless of whether it was the intelligence the Overwatch Council had obtained from the outside, or the bits and pieces of information Baiwa brothel had grasped, he could only come to a relatively vague conclusion. The Crown Prince's change had indeed begun half a year ago. At that time, Fan Xian was far away in Jiangnan and had no idea what had happened under the surface of Jingdo's peace. Without question, the venereal disease that had long troubled the Crown Prince and made him appear self-abased and weak had been cured. This matter caused the Imperial Academy of Medicine, who knew the inside story, to collectively sink into celebration. They all thought it was a favor from heaven and a blessing for the Qing kingdom. It was also from that time on that, because of the Crown Prince's recovery, his entire person began to emit a glow called confidence. He became calmer and revealed the steadiness that a future emperor should have in his calmness. The Empress Dowager liked this kind of change. The emperor also seemed to be pleasantly surprised. After receiving confirmation from Hongzhu, Fan Xian sank into some kind of deep thought. On a psychological level, he could deduce some things. However, the eldest princess may have only seen the Crown Prince as some kind of substitute, or even as a pet like a little white rabbit. But what about the Crown Prince? Even if he was the passive party, where did he get the courage from? Regardless of whether it was the Crown Prince's cowardice and arrogance in the past, or the current Crown Prince's steadiness and self-control, neither should have the courage to do such an absurd thing. Although it was beneficial from a political standpoint, the Crown Prince still did not seem like someone with this kind of courage, because he was not crazy enough. Thus, before he came to an agreement with Hongzhu, the first thing Fan Xian did was investigate the cause of this matter. He felt it was truly strange. The carriage jolted. Fan Xian's brows were furrowed tightly. As Fei Jie's successor, he was too familiar with things like medicine. After he had a general understanding of the entire situation, he unconsciously placed his suspicious gaze on the medicine. Medicine. In this world, although venereal disease was not an incurable disease, it was still something that lingered in a sickbed and was difficult to endure. Otherwise, the Crown Prince would not have suffered for so many years, and the Imperial Academy of Medicine would not have secretly troubled him for so many years. What kind of medicine could cure the Crown Prince in such a short amount of time? What kind of medicine could make the Crown Prince so much more daring? Thus, he arranged for Sangwon to begin investigating the clues along the way. Of course, he used another reason. However, after investigating, he found that the back of this clue was a ball of dense fog. Baiwa Brothel's intelligence gathering power was limited, and the Overwatch Council's supporting investigation had not made any progress. Fan Xian began to feel a glimmer of danger. It was as if he was being watched by an icy gaze from behind. Was this a trap? Could it be that someone had set up a trap and wanted him to expose these things? If he continued to dig deeper, he was worried that he would alert the powerful figure hidden behind the scenes. Thus, he decisively stopped the investigation of the medicine and turned back to the path he should be on. He understood one thing. No one knew of his relationship with Hongzhu. Since it was so, no one should think of using this layer of relationship. If there was another hand trying to control this matter, then their goal was the same as his. As long as he was not implicated when the matter happened, that hand would not be able to use him. The medicine was key, but it was not. The key was still the Crown Prince's heart. Perhaps the medicine could add fuel to the fire, but this kind of method of doing things was rare and powerful. Fan Xian guessed that if there really was a problem with the medicine, then who could have made it? In an instant, a few names immediately floated into his mind. The ones with the motive to do such a thing were himself, who wished at any moment to throw the eldest princess and crown prince off their horses, and the second prince, who had the help of the Yi family, but was beginning to faintly feel that the crown prince was going to steal his place in the eldest princess's heart. It could even be the emperor. In the carriage, Fan Xian jumped in fright and unconsciously shook his head. Although he had always been on guard against the emperor had treated him well and did not seem like this kind of person. Furthermore, putting aside how apologetic the emperor was toward the eldest princess, even if he wanted to clean the courtyard, he would not stoop to using such a dusty method. Of course, the first name that rose to Fan Xian's mind was actually Chen Pingping. From the medicine, he naturally thought of Fei Jia. However, he couldn't find anything. He didn't dare take the risk to investigate. Naturally, he couldn't confirm anything, so he could only stop. The carriage came to a remote courtyard. It was the one Wang Qinian had bought for a few hundred taels of silver. Fan Xian walked straight in and sat down on a chair in the innermost room. He silently looked at the wizened old man across from him. Wang Qinian said with a pained expression, "Ziyu is outside saying goodbye. He's going to Northern Qi tomorrow. Mutai doesn't dare to take over the first bureau." Fan Xian waved his hand to stop him and straightforwardly said, "You know I don't want to hear about these things. You could go find Sir Yan." Wang Qinian said with a mournful expression. Wang Qinian put on a long face and said, "This lowly official is not good at this. Besides, this is a crime punishable by the death of 9 generations." Fan Xian glared at him and said, "What crime is there? It's not like we did it." Wang Qinian glanced at him fearfully. He thought to himself that even if it wasn't the extermination of his entire family, if the people in the palace found out about it, even if he, the Overwatch Council's 2 wings, could fly, he would probably not be able to escape death. Fan Xian smiled warmly and patted his thin shoulder. "What does this mean?" "This means that you are the person I trust the most. Besides, you know everything about me. Any one of them is a matter of losing my head. Why would I be afraid of one more?" Wang Qinian suddenly felt great regret. After returning from Northern Qi, he should have followed Sir Fan Jr. and the director's intentions, and immediately taken over the first bureau instead of returning to Sir Fan Jr.'s side and retaking control of the Qinian unit. That way, he would not have seen the box that he should not have seen even if he was blind, or heard the secret that he should not have heard even if he was deaf. Someone is investigating. In the light snow in Qin Garden, Chen Pingping sat in a wheelchair with a thick fur cloak draped over him. He looked at the ice gradually forming on the surface of the pond in the garden and smiled slightly. "The investigation is very clever and well hidden. We still can't confirm who it is." Fei Jie glanced at the director and shook his head. "There are still 3 months until the scheduled time. I hope there won't be any trouble." Chapter 479. The left side of my head hurts badly, so I'm late. Sorry, if I can't take it and need to rest tomorrow. I will ask everyone for leave. Thank you. Fei Jie looked silently at the old man in the wheelchair. He knew that Director Chun had a clear understanding of his own body. Even if he wanted to say something comforting, he couldn't say it. The Overwatch Council was the darkest part of the new Qin kingdom. In this world, the only person who could truly understand a large part of history and understand Chen Pingping's intentions was this great grandmaster who used poison. In the middle of the year, Chen Pingping emphasized the time. After you leave Jingdo, don't come back. I know you've traveled all over the world in your life in the hope that one day you can take a ship to the lands of those foreigners and see how their medicine is made. Since you have this desire, it's best if you go earlier. Fei Jie didn't say anything for now. He knew that given the role he had once played in the military, the matter in the palace could not affect him. The reason the director urged him to leave the Qin kingdom and take a ship was because he wanted him to complete his life's ideals before the matter blew up, and let him leave that matter. Although he was old, he still had ideals. I should have gone a long time ago, Fei Jie said with a smile. However, I've taken on a student, and I always miss him. Go, Chen Pingping said sincerely. You only have one life. Do what you like to do. Otherwise, when you're old and crippled, you won't be able to walk even if you want to. Although I don't believe in the retribution the temple speaks of, you've killed countless people in your life. You will always draw attention. Of the 3 old poisoners, Xiao In is already dead. I heard that the one in Dongyi also suddenly got a strange disease. You're the only one left. You have to live on. Fei Jie was silent for a moment. He then said, I'll listen to you. In the middle of the year, I'll go to Dongyi and go out to sea. Chen Pingping glanced at him and smiled tiredly. Why won't you leave from Chuanzhou? First, that place has the smell of the past. I don't like to remember the past, Fei Jie said. Second, since I'm going out to sea alone, I don't want the emperor or Fan Xian to know where I'm going. Chen Pingping nodded. Fei Jie had a very special role in the Overwatch Council. He had resigned from his position in the Third Bureau many years ago, and was now considered to be one of the council's worshippers. The current head of the Third Bureau was his junior. Commissioner Fan Xian was his student. In all these years, he had been Chen Pingping's right-hand man and good friend, so he was very aloof in the council. Although there was still an empty room in the basement of the square building for him to conduct research, he rarely went there. His daily work of concocting medicines and fumigating poisons was all done in a courtyard in a corner of the capital. This courtyard was a monologue research department, and its funds were, of course, provided by the Overwatch Council. The corresponding servants and apprentices were all members of the Overwatch Council. The research results of a master of poisons were naturally quite valuable. Regardless of whether it was the arrow poison needed by the military, or the poison needed by the nobles in their backyard to kill each other out of jealousy, they were all objects that people salivated over. However, the defenses of this courtyard were not very strict. Because of Fei Jie's vicious and poisonous reputation, the enemies of northern Qi and Dongyi, as well as the nobles within the Qin kingdom, did not have the courage to go into the courtyard and pretend to be a thief. Who knew what kind of poisonous insects Fei Jie raised in the courtyard, or what kind of poisonous powder he scattered? The apprentices and servants who served Fei Jie were naturally not worried about this. They all carried antidote pills on them. Even if they mistakenly took them, there would be no danger to their lives. However, the people in Fei Jie's courtyard often faced financial danger. Because of the research of poisons and the purchase of rare raw materials, it always required a large amount of money. In the past few years, the palace treasury did not have enough money, and the Overwatch Council sometimes did not have enough money to allocate. When Fei Jie was doing experiments, he did not want to wait. Thus, the apprentice's monthly pay was often deducted. After the matter was over, Fei Jie often forgot to make up for it, and the apprentices did not dare to open their mouths to ask for it. Thus, their lives were not very satisfactory. As long as one was a member of the large organization that served the Qin kingdom, people would always find all kinds of ways to earn extra money and fill their pockets. The apprentices in the council were no exception. What they relied on was their understanding of poisons. Although they didn't dare enter that little room and take out and sell Sir Fei's treasured results, some unremarkable little playthings became a way for them to make money. During these 10 years, the assassins, wives, and mistresses all over the world all used different channels to share in the Overwatch Council's poisons. At the same time, money also flowed in. However, the danger of selling poison was too great. No one knew where the poison would be sold. Thus later, the apprentices began to steal Fei Jie's prescriptions to sell. In the beginning, business was not very good because not many people dared to use the medicine Fei Jie prescribed. It was not until Fei Jie, as Fei Jie's personal disciple, began to treat his own injuries in the royal palace. Later, Fan Roro inherited her brother's skills and began to give lectures at the Royal Academy of Medicine. Only then did Sir Fei Jie's ability to treat illnesses truly receive the recognition of the market. Selling medicine was good, safe, and free of future troubles. 5 or 6 months ago, an apprentice by Fei Jie's side had sold a prescription. This prescription had brought him a great deal of money. He sold this prescription to the famous Huichun Hall in Jingdou. He was particularly careful when he sold it. He did not reveal any clues on the prescription, or reveal his face for the other party to see. He only handed over the money, and handed over the goods. For months ago, this apprentice suddenly became seriously ill. Perhaps it was because he had been in contact with poisons for many years, and was infected. Many treatments were ineffective, and he died on the bed coughing up blood. Before that student died, the Huichun Hall had already used that prescription to successfully develop the first pill. After confirming its effects on a test subject, the old shopkeeper of the Huichun Hall had wisely turned the existence of this pill into the greatest secret of the Huichun Hall. However, he had not discovered the side effects of the pill at all. He knew that many nobles in the capital needed this medicine. This was what Huichun Hall relied on to display their power in Jingdou. Of course, the old shopkeeper would not be stupid enough to let the prescription leak out. Instead, he used a secret connection to send one pill to the owner behind him. The owner behind Huichun Hall was a 6th-level master from Taichung Temple. This master had always been careful and did not let his connection to Huichun Hall leak out. When he had confirmed the effects of the medicine, a wave of excitement immediately took over his face. Taichung Temple was responsible for matters related to the royal family and moved around the palace. Of course, they faintly knew about the so-called hidden illness of the crown prince in the Eastern Palace these years. This master faintly saw the possibility of his meteoric rise. However, he was not satisfied with just being a person who applied medicine. Thus, he took a detour to find the manor of another clan relative and delivered the medicine. Of course, he did not explicitly say that it was the result of his own medicinal hall's research. He only said that after searching bitterly, he had finally found this medicine among the foreign goods in Dongyi. That clan relative's eyes naturally lit up when he heard this. The master of Taichung Temple had to say that he did not have the prescription and needed to continuously search for it. He calculated clearly in his heart. As long as this medicine remained in his hands, the noble in the Eastern Palace would always need him. Then, his present and future prospects would naturally be vast. The clan relative knew what the master of Taichung Temple was thinking, but did not expose him. He stroked his beard, smiled a few times, and said a few words of praise. He only said that he would take the medicine, and would not say that the medicine would be sent to the palace. They both knew this. From then on, the miraculous pill personally developed and refined by the old shopkeeper of Huichun Hall was sent through the efforts of the master of Taichung Temple, who worked hard to find it, to the manor of the clan relative who needed the medicine to replenish his strength. Then through a secret channel, it was sent to the royal palace. Accompanied by tea, it was sent into the crown prince's thin lips. 1 pill every 10 days. It had never stopped. All of this was done in secret. Even if someone investigated, it could be broken at any time on a certain line. However, no one on this line knew that from the beginning, all of the relationships and possibilities on this line had been calculated by someone else. They thought it was secretive, and everything was in their control. They did not know that they were actually pawns being controlled by someone else. In the little courtyard, Fan Xian left behind Wang Qinian, who was deep in thought, and walked to the side of the well. Deng Ziyu had been waiting outside the entire time. Seeing that he was here, he quickly came up to report. A glimmer of reluctance and a bit of nervousness naturally appeared on his face. Tomorrow, He would head far away to northern Qi to take over Wang Qingyan's position as the head spy in the north. Although this position was nominally under the jurisdiction of the Fourth Bureau, it had always reported directly to the director or the commissioner. It was a very important position. After Yan Bingyan was Wang Qingyan, and after Wang Qingyan was him. He knew that his ability was not in this area. He was afraid that there would be a large gap between him and the other two officials in the north. Thus, he sincerely asked Sir Fan Jr. for advice on the matters he should pay attention to on this trip. Everyone under heaven knows that you are my trusted aide, Fan Xian warned. This cannot be hidden from the northern Qi people, and there is no need to hide it from them. However, you are not like Wang Qingyan, who can throw off the brocade guard behind him at any time, so you have to be more careful than him. He paused and then said, So, you have to get used to playing the role of a diplomatic official. There are many kinds of spies. Sir Yan Jr. was a secret spy, and Wang Qingyan was half light and half dark. You can only be an open spy. Unless there are special circumstances, do not use the network in the north. You are careful enough. There is a lot of information that actually does not need to be secretly inquired about. You only need to attend a few banquets and chat with the nobles of northern Qi, and you will be able to find out. Deng Ziyu was slightly startled. Sir Fan Jr.'s new way of speaking immediately opened another door in his mind. Spies, could it be done without eavesdropping? Right now, the two countries have a honeymoon relationship. Fan Xian smiled slightly. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, Everything is based on this. Don't embarrass the northern Qi people too much. Deng Ziyu nodded and asked, Then how do we sort out the network in the north? My identity is too obvious. You said it earlier. It is not easy for me to get in touch. Lin Wen or Lin Jing. Right now he should still be in Shangjing. He is an old man, and will tell you what to pay attention to. Fan Xian thought for a bit, and then said, I have already told you in private about the first level. However, don't go to that place. If there are any instructions, go find Sija. He has a business network under him. It is more convenient to send messages to the first level. Deng Ziyu knew that the first level was the oil shop that Sir Fan Jr. had privately mentioned a few days ago. He thought that Sir Fan's arrangements were appropriate and nodded. If there is a private message for me heading south, go from Xiaomingji. Fan Xian thought for a bit, and then said, Baohua Brothel's branch in Shangjing is about to open. At that time, I will have them contact you. Deng Ziyu thought that Sir Fan had already arranged everything, so he did not need to spend too much effort. Fan Xian looked at his calm face, but a faint apologetic feeling welled up in his heart. Having Deng Ziyu reveal his identity and go to northern Qi was actually to make it inconvenient for him to come into contact with northern Qi's spy network. It would give his brother a chance to extend his hand inside, and at the same time, allow Baohua Brothel to mix in. Deng Ziyu had never doubted Sir Fan Jr.'s intentions, but Fan Xian had an absurd thought. He wanted to see if he could turn the entire Qing Kingdom's northern Qi spy network into his own eyes and ears. This network was too important for Sija's business and his own dealings with northern Qi. He gently coughed and then said, On this trip north, I will take 300 black knights to escort you through Tsangzhou. Naturally, there will be northern Qi people to meet you there. Other than court matters, the most important thing is that you bring me alive into Shangjing. After entering Shangjing, don't find anyone else. Go directly to the temple of Tianyi Dao to find Haitang. Listen to her arrangements for the rest. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at the bare-chested young man chopping wood in the corner of the courtyard. The young man's life was full of vigor, but there was still immaturity between his brows. It was impossible to tell how old he was. Deng Ziyu followed his gaze and furrowed his brows. Haidang can arrange it, but after the northern Qi people find out, will they have any thoughts? Fan Xian's expression was calm as he said, The northern Qi people's thoughts have nothing to do with us. I am just sending him over. Deng Ziyu hesitated for a moment and then said probingly, But if you return him to see Lily, how will you control him in the future? He was Fan Xian's trusted aide, so he knew the story of how the commissioner had forcefully taken this young man from the director. He also knew that this unremarkable young man, who had been locked up in the little courtyard for almost 2 years, was actually the younger brother of the current Northern Qi imperial consort Sea Lily. There are many ways to control him. Right now I don't need this method, so I might as well be generous. It will be more comfortable for everyone to work together, Fan Xian said with a smile. In his heart, however, he was thinking that the interests between him and Northern Qi had long been intertwined. Whether a hostage was there or not, it didn't make much of a difference. Sea Lily's brother had long lost the importance he once had. Deng Ziyu no longer had any objections. Fan Xian waved his hand and summoned the young man over. Looking at the unfairness and hatred that had yet to be smoothed out on the young man's face, he warmly said, "You are about to go to Shangjing. Is there anything you want to buy for your sister?" The young man spat on the ground. Fan Xian and Deng Ziyu both laughed. Fan Xian looked at him and shook his head. "After you go to Shangjing, change your temper. I don't want you to cause trouble for your sister. Also, don't blame me for locking you up for 2 years. You also know about the problems of your past. If I hadn't locked you up, you would probably be long dead. After you go to Shangjing and see your sister, remember to say hello to her for me." Suddenly, he thought of the journey he had taken with Sea Lily in the same carriage 2 years ago. His thoughts wandered slightly, but he immediately calmed down and said, "Say thank you for me." The young man didn't quite understand and scratched his head. He had only seen Fan Xian a few times, and had always been locked up in the courtyard. He didn't know the rumors outside, but he knew that this young noble was certainly an important official in Qing Kingdom. However, he seemed a bit too young. He was a bit surprised that this noble surnamed Fan seemed to be very familiar with his sister, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. It was as if they had a friendship. Hearing this person say this, was he really supposed to be grateful to him? The young man scratched his head again. When the sky darkened, Fan Xian and Wang Qinian left the courtyard and got into the carriage. In the carriage, Fan Xian looked forward and smiled mischievously. "Lao Wang, your house is also in this area. Why haven't you invited me to sit?" Wang Qinian looked at the smile on his face and felt a pang in his heart. He remembered when he had peeked at the love letter between Fan Xian and Haitang, and Fan Xian's last threat. In a trembling voice he said, "Sir, my daughter is still young. Let's wait a few more years." Fan Xian paused and almost spat out a mouthful of blood. He glared angrily at the old man and thought, "What kind of beautiful girl can you give birth to with your appearance?" It was just a joke. However, under Wang Qinian's heavy worry, his ability to be a supporting character had clearly decreased. The carriage stopped at the back door of Wang Qinian's house. There was no one in the carriage, but there was no one in the manor either. 2 commoners with ordinary faces wearing coarse cotton jackets appeared in the alley opposite the manor of an imperial relative in the south of the city. The 2 of them had their hands in their sleeves and were half crouching on the ground chatting. However, the content of their conversation did not seem very casual. "It's this family. Almost all of the Empress's relatives have died. This is a very distant relative. What's the use of knowing?" Chapter 480. Of course, Fan Xian could not pretend to be an unhygienic commoner and stand guard in front of the imperial relative's manor for 18 days. He was only confirming with Wang Qinian that the hidden line was indeed, as they had calculated. They had no intention of investigating further down this line. Furthermore, he knew that today was the 7th. After confirming with Hangzhou on the 20th, he would have to leave Jingdo at the beginning of February and head to Jiangnan again. There was too little time in between. It was impossible to grasp any pattern. The only thing he could rely on was Wang Qinian's unfathomable tracking skills. After confirming the target, the 2 of them left the entrance of the imperial relative's manor and returned to the back door of the courtyard in the old city. Although Fan Xian was interested in seeing Wang Qinian's daily life, these days had been rather tense. He didn't have much time to enjoy life. With a wave of his hand, he climbed into the carriage. All of his equipment was left in the black carriage. He took off his outer clothing and checked his sleeve crossbow and medicine pouch. Only then did he take out a cosmetic box and carefully apply it to his face. He then used the Overwatch Council's special glue to stick the corners of his brows down. Immediately, the distance between his eyes and brows changed. He also added an unremarkable mole on his chin. The elegant young master immediately became an unremarkable passerby. The carriage stopped outside the Lotus Pond Square in the west of the city. Fan Xian and his people had long gotten off the carriage and merged into the complicated crowd in the west of the city. The area of the west of Jingdo was not large. Compared to the other cities, it was not rich enough, quiet enough, or noble enough. Particularly, the area around Lotus Pond Square was a slum district. The people who lived there all day long considered the problem of survival. Only when there was food in the family storeroom would people consider things like etiquette and morality. Thus, the people in the square did not have a bit more integrity to stand in the turbid world, because of the name Lotus Pond Square. On the contrary, it was a mix of dragons and snakes. There were all kinds of shady business. Passerby Fan Xian used the rain hat at the back of his clothes to block out the small snowflakes. With a dark expression, he stepped through the mud in the alley toward the depths of Lotus Pond Square. His expression did not attract much attention in Lotus Pond Square. The commoners on the side of the street and the shopkeepers in the shops couldn't be bothered to glance at him. There were too many people in the square with dark expressions, as if their fathers had died. There were too many brothers on the street. It was not every day that they could collect their debts. Not every time the Jingdo government caught them, they were able to escape. The brothers on the street were righteous and vicious. Their moods were also very violent, so it was normal for them to be gloomy. Passing through a narrow alley with broken eaves, Fan Xian once again fell into the encirclement of the prostitutes standing on the street. Fortunately, it was still early. Although the dedicated prostitutes had come out to stand, the shoddy makeup on their faces and their incessant yawns spoke of their low fighting ability. Only then was Fan Xian able to leave lightly and burrow into a little wooden building in the back of the street to find his destination. The wooden room was filled with an unpleasant smell. The moment Fan Xian entered the door, he couldn't resist rubbing his nose. However, he did not take off the hat on his head. He sat directly by the bed and took out a token from his clothes, handing it to the vigilant paralyzed man on the bed. The paralyzed man's hand could still move. He stared at this uninvited guest with a face full of nervousness. After accepting the token and looking at it closely for a while, he lowered his voice and said, "Since you are one of us, why did you come up so rashly?" Fan Xian didn't have time to argue with him. Straightforwardly he said, "Has anything good come out from inside recently?" The paralyzed man's expression changed. He didn't know what kind of person this hateful person in front of him was in the gang for him to ask so directly. Since he knew about this matter that required his head, he must be a trusted aide of the gang leader. He felt around in the smelly blanket for a while and pulled out countless boxes. Fan Xian opened them one by one and looked at them closely. His face still had that lifeless expression. It was clear he was not satisfied. The paralyzed man looked at his expression and shook his head. He rummaged around in the porcelain pillow under his neck for a while before finally pulling out half a piece of jade and handing it over. Fan Xian accepted the jade and looked at it closely. The color of the jade was excellent. It was warm and sparkling. It was truly a good item. Furthermore, the cloud patterns carved on it were clearly a royal item. He nodded his head with satisfaction. Not bad. This kind of good thing, the more the better. The paralyzed man smiled proudly. Fan Xian also smiled in his heart. He knew that the paralyzed man in front of him was not as pitiful as he appeared on the surface. Jingdo was the place where the distinguished and wealthy gathered, particularly the royal palace. Since ancient times, tens of thousands of people had provided for the emperor and various nobles. The eunuchs and serving girls who served the emperor and nobles would secretly steal these things out to feed the dark members of the people under heaven. It was like this in the royal palace, and it was also like this in various large manors. Furthermore, there was too much money and jewelry that could not see the light of day, that needed to be laundered and exchanged for land deeds in various provinces and counties. Naturally, only the professionals at the bottom could do this kind of thing. The underworld was this kind of professional, so the truly powerful gangs in the world would all leave a small branch in Jingdo. These Jianghu people did not dare oppose the court, but they would not be courteous in being the court's sewers and earning bits and pieces of silver to spend. Speaking of which, it was very strange. It was because these Jianghu people were unusually peaceful that Jingdo still did not have any famous names in the underworld. The Hulua gang was a very unremarkable gang responsible for taking over the stolen goods in the royal palace. When Fan Xian was in Hangzhou, he had talked a lot with Xia Qifei and had some understanding of these secret powers. Only now did he know that the Hulua gang had a fixed passageway in the palace. He couldn't help feeling deep veneration for them, which was why he had come to Lotus Pond Square today. This paralyzed man was responsible for the first part of the Hulua gang's sale of stolen goods in Jingdo. These people were doing things that required their entire families to be executed, so they were very careful. Each part was not connected, and the people receiving the goods often changed. This gave Fan Xian an opportunity to take advantage of. As for the token, it was something the Overwatch Council had prepared many years ago. The paralyzed man looked at his satisfied smile and proudly said, "Apparently, this was something the previous emperor had gifted to the Empress Dowager's paternal family. However, something happened later. For some reason, it has now returned to the Eastern Palace. This took a lot of effort." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He smiled and said, "Why would the nobles care about these little things? They just casually leave them in the storeroom. After a few decades, they won't forget to use them." The paralyzed man sighed and said, "Yes, if this piece of jade was sold in Jiangnan and then sold in Jiangbei, it could probably buy thousands of mu." Fan Xian didn't want to accompany him in sighing and said, "First time meeting, I don't know the rules." He spoke very straightforwardly. On the contrary, the paralyzed man did not have any suspicions. He took out an account book from under the blanket and pointed to the space for first-class wine written on it. "It's here." Fan Xian smiled and said, "You paralyzed man, you sure can hide things under the blanket." The paralyzed man mumbled a few words, as if he was recalling the past. He had followed the gang leader to kill everywhere, and had been beaten to a pulp by someone with a hammer. The gang leader had taken pity on him, which was why he had come to Jingdo to manage these matters. Fan Xian didn't know much about the story of the Hulua gang, so he didn't respond. After he signed the book with his altered handwriting, he handed over a banknote from his clothes and said, "The first installment is 30%, right? Don't take more from me." The paralyzed man looked at the 1,000 liang banknote and nodded. "That's about right. Although this jade is certainly worth more than this, it is after all a taboo item. I can only sell it at a discount." After doing all this, Fan Xian carefully put the jade away. Without saying anything more, he walked out of the dark room. Walking along the mud-covered streets of Lotus Pond Square, the sky was still dark and gloomy. Fan Xian's mood, which had been tormented by the matter for a long time, relaxed. He had already thought through how to handle the entire matter. Although this plan was indeed complicated and annoying, Fan Xian had no other choice. In order to ensure Hangzhou's safety, and to keep himself hidden behind the scenes, he had to approach the truth with so many twists and turns and expose it. Now that he had a plan in mind, although he didn't know if there would be any problems, it was much better than a few days ago, when he faced a pot of braised pork shoulder and couldn't find a place to eat. He had thought through the entire process. All that was left was for Hangzhou to handle. Of course, he also needed the emperor to be as sensitive, suspicious, and full of imagination and intelligence as Fan Xian expected. Just as the eldest princess and Fan Xian had always thought, the Qing emperor was indeed a sensitive and suspicious person. A figure who had stood at the top of politics for a long time would always imagine the worst of all conspiracies and use his intelligence. Thus, the more Fan Xian thought about it, the more relaxed he became. He felt that the emperor was going to be played by him this time. To be able to scheme and not let himself fall into it, Fan Xian felt a rare glimmer of pride. Although he was now a 9th-level ace and a powerful figure, he had always maintained a calm state of mind. However, he could not suppress his pride today. It was probably because, ever since he had entered the Overwatch Council, he had always been weak in the area of conspiracies. In the past, he had Yan Bingyun's help, so he didn't see any problems. However, after the Jiaozhou incident, Chen Pingping had cursed him harshly in his letter, and was very disdainful of his ability to weave conspiracies. Thus, Fan Xian was truly proud today. The more he thought about it, the prouder he became. Just as he was feeling proud, he saw a frustrated person under the archway at the exit of Lotus Pond Square. Fan Xian looked at the person with the blue cloth table under the archway, shouting for business in a loud voice. He couldn't help but stop in a daze. Stopping his steps, he hid behind the crowd and took a closer look. It was a litigation master. He was shouting at the top of his lungs behind the blue cloth table to drum up business. His face was slightly pale. It was as if something had happened to his body. Even his voice appeared weak. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and let the rain hat cover most of his face. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the table. A strange feeling rose in his heart. That litigation master's business was very bad. Not only did no one ask him to write a lawsuit for them, not even a single person asked him to write a lawsuit on their behalf. Furthermore, some of the commoners who seemed to vaguely know the inside story were walking far away from the blue cloth table, as if afraid of being tainted by bad luck. Fan Xian furrowed his brows, and then left Lotus Pond Square. About an hour later, in a private room in a normal restaurant, Fan Xian's face was full of smiles. He pushed a plate of food in front of him and said, "Eat slowly and talk slowly. Why are you like this now?" Sitting across from him was the litigation master from Lotus Pond Square. He was also the person who had fought Fan Xian's first lawsuit in Jingdo, and had later been kidnapped by Fan Xian to Jiangnan to help him in the Ming family lawsuit. Song Shuren. Song Shuren had a bandit nickname, Fu Zue. He was also known as the best litigation master in the world. He had always traveled in the government offices. How could he have fallen to the point of setting up a stall on the street? At the time, Fan Xian had been shocked when he saw him on the street. It was only later that he had his subordinates invite him over. However, he didn't dare go to Baiyue brothel. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the dejected litigation master. Although he guessed something, he still couldn't resist opening his mouth to ask about his recent situation. Song Shuren didn't eat. He only sipped a mouthful of white wine and gazed deeply at Fan Xian. Shortly after, he sighed and laughed bitterly 3 times. He didn't say anything. "Speak. Does it have something to do with me?" Fan Xian asked. Song Shuren sighed again. After a moment of silence, he said, "Since you guessed it, then I won't be afraid to embarrass myself. After returning from Jiangnan, the people in Tongren and the other streets knew of my glory in Jiangnan and looked at me more highly. They also knew that I was working for you, so they all nodded and bowed to me. However, later the rumors changed. For some reason, not only did no one ask me to fight a lawsuit, even my good friends all left me." "You don't know why?" Fan Xian sighed. "You and I both know why." Song Shuren forced a smile and said, "Even if I knew, would I dare to go around crying injustice?" Fan Xian fell silent and listened to Song Shuren's sorrowful and cold narration. Only then did he know that the once best litigation master in the world had lived such a wretched life in the next few months. Not only was it a problem of not being able to earn money, but it seemed that in an instant, the entire Qing kingdom's bureaucracy had begun to target Song Shuren. The Jingdo government, Ministry of Justice, and even the Ministry of Rights and Taichung Temple all came to make trouble for him. They used all kinds of excuses. In any case, they stripped away all of his family property like it had been hit by wind and rain. No matter how eloquent Song Shuren was, how could he stand against the court's unreasonable methods? Furthermore, the powerful figures he was familiar with in the past were now silent. It was as if they were afraid of the person behind Song Shuren. Presently, Song Shuren could only take his family and rent a place like Lotus Pond Square. His life could be said to be wretched. Fan Xian and he met each other's eyes and shook their heads at the same time. The two of them both knew the source of all of this. Song Shuren had helped Fan Xian fight the Ming family case in Jiangnan. Putting aside how much he had helped Fan Xian, the important thing was that through Song Shuren's mouth, Fan Xian's idea that the eldest son's right to inherit naturally could not be violated. This sacred rule that was not in Qing law, but had entered people's hearts, had been broken into pieces. This was a great taboo in the palace. The Empress Dowager had quietly said something, and there were countless people who thought of ways to make Song Shuren shut up. This was a very deep lesson. At least he's fine. Song Shuren touched his neck with some lingering fear. To be able to survive is already heaven's pity. Fan Xian knew that Song Shuren had not been killed completely because the nobles in the palace had given him some face. He couldn't help saying self-mockingly, "Even if no one dared to help you, why didn't you come find me? When all is said and done, this matter was caused by me. Since you came to find me for help, I had to put in some effort." Song Shuren smiled bitterly and said, "I fought a case for you and almost had my family destroyed. How could I go and make trouble for you?" Fan Xian knew that this person did not mean what he said. He was probably afraid that if he came to his door, it would instead add more trouble. He looked at Song Shuren and smiled. "Don't worry about anything." He took out a banknote from his clothes and handed it over. Song Shuren raised his head and looked at the frightening amount written at the top. He couldn't help but jump in fright. Although he was also a person who had seen the world, he really didn't dare to accept such a large sum of money. Fan Xian said, "I will immediately arrange for your entire family to leave the capital. You don't have to worry about safety. Take this money and use it first. Consider it my compensation to you." Song Shuren was silent for a long time and didn't reply. Fan Xian glanced at him and said, "Relax, if I wanted to kill you to escape disaster, I would have done so long ago in Jiangnan. You know, I have never been afraid of killing a few people. You have to understand my personality. As long as someone has helped me, I will certainly protect them and give them sufficient compensation. The resentment in the palace will fade in a few days," Fan Xian said meaningfully. "At that time, as long as I protect you, who would dare to touch you?" The 10th day of the first month was also known among the Qing people as the last 10. It could be considered a relatively important day in the new year. Although it was not like the tens of thousands of people going out on the 7th day, the streets were still lively. Having planned everything, Fan Xian appeared particularly relaxed. He sat in the carriage with Wan and strolled around Jingdou for half a day before. Under the endless urging of his wife and Teng Zijing, he changed his route and drove directly to Prince Huqing's manor, which was not far from the royal palace. The doors of Prince Huqing's manor were wide open, but there were not many guests. The great prince was standing on the stone steps, waiting for Fan Manor's carriage. The carriage stopped in front of the manor. The great prince looked at Fan Xian and smiled coldly. "You've come so late. Don't slip away first later." The title of the book was Godly Movement Mecha. The book number was 1001948. Highly recommended because this guy's public version is free and updates 5K a day. Such sincerity and excellence truly makes me admire him. Also, my illness has not healed and is very uncomfortable. My condition is very poor, please forgive me. Recently, I haven't added much because it is not convenient. Please understand. Chapter 481. The snow in Jingdou stopped and fell again. It was not as free and clear as the snow in Shangjing in northern Qi, nor was it as annoying as the lack of rain and snow in Danzhou. It was as lingering and annoying as the spring rain in Jiangnan. Fan Xian stretched out his hand to brush the snow from his hair angrily. Looking at the great prince at the door of the manor, he said, "It's just a meal. Why are you so nervous?" In reality, the great prince was not wrong. If the inscription on the invitation did not have the name of the great princess of northern Qi, Fan Xian would not have escaped early. He might not even have come. Fan Xian thought painfully, "Why did you summon me, a descendant of the Fan family, for a gathering of royal brothers?" He really didn't want to come. Firstly, he didn't want to see the second prince and his wife when the situation was unclear. Secondly, he was thinking about those sinister things. If the crown prince, the target of his plot, continued to talk to him gently, what should he do? There was no place for him to speak. His wife was already standing in front of the great prince, beaming with joy. She giggled and said a few words, and then the two of them walked side by side into the prince's manor. Fan Xian looked at this scene of deep sibling affection and thought to himself that this brother was not his cousin. His heart ached slightly. How could he not enter the manor? Fan Xian had not been to Prince Huqing's manor many times. Once he entered the manor, there were naturally people waiting on him to sit. Fan Xian looked around and didn't see anyone else, so he relaxed. On the other side of the room, Wana was talking warmly about something with the great brother she hadn't seen in a long time. Fan Xian was bored sitting alone in the hall and couldn't be bothered to interrupt. He half closed his eyes and rested. However, the words beside him kept drilling into his ears. One moment, Wana was teasing the great prince about his appearance after marriage. The next moment, the great prince was asking Wana if she had gotten used to life in Jiangnan, if Fan Xian had bullied her, and how the scenery in Jiangnan was. What kind of yamen was the Hangzhou society? By the time Wana explained clearly to the great prince that the Hangzhou conference had nothing to do with the yamen, Fan Xian couldn't resist yawning. He felt bored. This pair of brother and sister were important figures in the royal family. One of them was a general who had once led troops and killed people. How come when they talked, they were no different from the gossipy women of the Tung family? Just as he was cursing to himself, he suddenly felt a breeze behind him. He vigilantly opened his eyes and turned around, only to see a beautiful young woman dressed in gorgeous clothing lift the curtains and enter. Fan Xian was slightly startled. He stared at the flower in the woman's hair and smiled. "Greetings, Wang Fei." The person who had come was the great princess of Northern Qi, the present Wang Fei. When this foreign noble had married into the Qing kingdom, Fan Xian had been the envoy. The two of them had traveled thousands of li together, so they were more familiar with each other than the others. However, ever since she and the great prince had married, it was not convenient for Fan Xian and her to maintain contact. Even the secret promises they had made to each other basically had no room to put into practice. After not seeing each other for a long time, he felt a bit unfamiliar. After the first greeting, Fan Xian didn't know what to say. Lin Wanner saw the princess come out and quickly stood up to salute, but was forced by the princess to call her sister-in-law, according to the customs of the people. Wang Fei's appearance was dignified, particularly the magnanimity at the tips of her brows and the corners of her eyes. It made one feel amiable and happy. However, at this moment, her calm gaze turned and stared at Fan Xian. Revealing a strange expression, she said, "I haven't seen you in a long time. How have you been?" Fan Xian was facing her. He had long seen the glimmer of severity and anger in the gentleness in her eyes. Additionally, she had called him Little Duke twice. He knew she was angry. However, he knew that Wang Fei's anger had nothing to do with the matters between a man and a woman. She also wasn't truly angry at him for not seeing or communicating much after sending his relatives back home. It was probably because of the Yongsong Alley incident. He unconsciously glanced at the great prince's expression and found that he could still force himself to be calm. He could only hide his awkwardness and smile. "What the great princess is saying. It is best to call me Fan Xian as usual. How about brother-in-law?" Although this joke was not funny, Fan Xian's way of addressing her was very particular. He still respectfully called her princess, using an old form of address. Firstly, it made her think of their old feelings. Secondly, he knew that Wang Fei would feel much better after hearing this form of address. Although the great princess of Northern Qi was married to the great prince of the Qing kingdom, and it was not a disgrace to her identity, she was, after all, marrying far away in a foreign country. Furthermore, the background of the marriage was the Qing kingdom's victory in the war between the two countries. Thus, for the Northern Qi people, particularly the great princess, this marriage was not very glorious. Furthermore, the great prince was titled Prince Huqing. What did that mean? Each time he thought of the great prince's title, Fan Xian couldn't resist wanting to laugh. He thought that the emperor was indeed a dark and vengeful person. The great princess probably hated Prince Huqing's name. As expected, Wang Fei paused upon hearing the words great princess. She had lived in the Qing kingdom for almost 2 years, married a good man, and lived a good life. However, she was after all in a foreign land. Although she strictly forbade the servants in the manor from using her full title, it had been a long time since anyone had called her princess. Wang Fei's gaze immediately softened. She looked at Fan Xian and smiled slightly, temporarily giving up on the idea of making trouble for him. Lin Wan'er and the Great Prince were both smart people. They could tell that Fan Xian and Wang Fei had carried out a certain level of testing in the previous 2 sentences. Involuntarily, they looked at each other and couldn't resist shaking their heads, thinking that these two were very tired. The 4 of them sat down and chatted for a while. Fan Xian couldn't resist turning his head to glance in the direction of the main door. Shaking his head, he said, "I said I came early today, but Wan'er insisted on rushing me. Everyone is here, just waiting for you." The Great Prince glanced at him and said, "You as a new duke, have a lot of face to have 2 princes waiting for you." Fan Xian was slightly surprised. "The Crown Prince will not come today," the Great Prince explained. The Great Prince explained and said that Chengqian had already sent a valuable gift. The second prince, the second princess, and the Hongqing siblings had already sat in the back garden. The Crown Prince not coming made Fan Xian feel much more at ease. He knew that this was a normal thing. The Crown Prince's identity was different. He was the heir to the country. Although his position seemed to have wavered these 2 years, his position was still higher than that of the other princes. When the royal family gathered, he had to be invited. However, it was not convenient for him to come. Wan'er said in surprise, "Second brother and the others are already here. Then, what are we still sitting here for?" This was not a stupid question. It was to purposely lessen the negative effect the Great Prince's words had on the atmosphere in the hall. The Great Prince listened to Wan'er's words and smiled. "Let's go over now." He then glanced at Fan Xian. Fan Xian laughed bitterly and thought, "Since I'm already here, are you still afraid that I'll make a scene in the manor and beat up the second prince?" As he thought this, he rose and led Wan'er toward the back garden. The Great Prince and his wife shook their heads at the same time, thinking that Fan Xian truly did not have the self-awareness of being a guest. They also followed him toward the back garden. As they left the hall, Wang Fei thought of the secret dealings between Fan Xian and her own king, and couldn't help but furrow her brows. To the side, the Great Prince sighed. His heart trembled. This manor had been built by imperial edict the year before. Its main purpose was to be used for the marriage between the 2 countries. In order to reflect the face of the Qing kingdom, the manor had not been thrifty at all. It was especially extravagant and took up a large amount of space. The group of people walked toward the garden for a long time before they saw a flower hall in the distance facing a lake. Faint sounds of conversation could be heard coming from inside. The lake was not large. The weather was slightly better than the day before. The thin ice on the surface of the water had shattered, but could not be moved. It rose and fell with the lake water, and reflected the faint gray light from the clouds in the sky. It looked like countless pieces of gemstones. The flower hall was particularly exquisite. The black wooden windows on the 3 sides, facing the lake, were well sealed. Inside there were cotton curtains that blocked out the wind. In the middle, about half the height of a person, there was a narrow opening. It was inlaid with high-quality glass produced by the palace treasury. Such a design allowed the cold wind on the lake to not disturb the interest of the young nobles. It also allowed one to admire the beautiful winter scenery through the window. It was very thoughtful. Fan Xian looked and smiled. "I like this place. If you like it, come more often in the future. It's not like you're an outsider." The Great Prince's eyes looked forward. He didn't know if the word outsider had a deeper meaning. He said, "At first this manor was grander, but I didn't like it. Fortunately, Wang Fei was clever and changed it a lot. It is no longer what it used to be. If you really like it, you should go visit her." Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at Wang Fei. He smiled and didn't say anything. The Great Prince said with a bit of pride, "It doesn't matter if other people say I'm henpecked. In any case, whatever she likes, I will get it for her. Just this circle of glass along the flower hall cost me a lot of silver." Hearing these words, Wang Fei liked it in her heart. But she couldn't keep her face in front of Fan Xian and his wife. She quietly glared at him. The Great Prince chuckled and changed the topic. "Speaking of this glass, it really is expensive. Speaking of which, you are now the head of the palace treasury. In the future, if you want to change glass, you have to sell it to me at a lower price." Fan Xian begged for mercy. "I say, Your Highness, please spare me. As a great general, do you still care about this little bit of glass? Don't say it's cheap. In the future, If you want anything from the palace treasury, write me a letter and I'll buy it for you. The great prince was not happy. He shook his head and said, the palace treasury is important. The silver you earn for the court has to be spent on the river works and border problems. You can't take advantage of it here. Fan Xian knew the great prince was such a loyal person. He was not surprised. He smiled and said, however, you're using glass to please the great princess. I'm afraid you'll have to spend a lot of money in the future. The great prince asked strangely. What do you mean? Is there a lack of glass in my courtyard? Wang Fei covered her mouth and smiled to the side without saying anything. Fan Xian laughed mockingly and said, the great princess grew up in the northern Qi royal palace. You haven't been to the royal palace. The roof of the great hall is completely made of glass. Sunlight can seep in and reflect on the green jade platform, and the clear water and white fish beside it. The great prince was shocked inside. In the past, I had only heard of it. I thought it couldn't be so exaggerated. Wang Fei has also never talked to me about it. Is it actually true? He clicked his tongue and sighed. Other thoughts rose in his heart. He thought to himself that the northern Qi royal palace was so luxurious. No wonder the strength of the country was weakening by the day, and couldn't withstand a single blow. However, these words couldn't be said generously in front of his wife, so he could only swallow them down. Fan Xian had said those words earlier. He had also sunk into the memories of his trip to northern Qi. He was very willing to admire spectacular or extremely beautiful things, so his impression of Shangjing had always been good. Of course, the girls in the city were also not bad. Involuntarily, a strange smile rose to the corners of his lips. Wang Fei also began to miss the scenery of her home country. Lin Wanner looked at the smile at the corner of Fan Xian's lips, and couldn't resist pressing her lips together and huffing. Just like this, each with their own thoughts, they entered the flower hall. In the hall, 2 men and 1 woman had already come to greet them. It was the second prince and Hongcheng. Princess Ro Jia affectionately called one her sister, Wanner affectionately called second brother, and Hongcheng affectionately called Nji. They chatted leisurely as they looked at the lake view and the tributes sent from the south. It was as if nothing had happened these past few years in Jingdo. It was as if Fan Xian and the second prince were truly 2 brothers who could not be more intimate. Was this a natural ability of the royal family? As Fan Xian sighed in his heart, he listened to everyone's conversation. He knew the true meaning of the great prince's banquet. Furthermore, he was worried that Hongqing would once again step onto the second prince's boat. Although he was also very good at this kind of conversation, he was still not as used to it as those who had grown up in the royal family. He begged for mercy and ran off to pee. In the corner of a small courtyard not far from the flower hall, Fan Xian, who had been brought here by a servant, was shocked. He looked at the girl who came out from inside, the girl whose eyes were as bright as jade, without a trace of impurity. Fan Xian waved his hand to have the servant leave. Looking at Yi Ling, whose face was full of shock and whose hand was still at the waist of her dress, he said with both amusement and anger, "Girl, you should pay attention to your appearance. Don't you know to tidy up in the inner room before coming out? How can you let the servants see you?" Yi Ling covered her mouth and smiled. "I look like this, teacher." Once the words left her mouth, the 2 of them froze at the same time and sank into silence. Only now did they remember that after not seeing each other for a year, Yi Ling had long married and become a Wang Fei. She was no longer the unruly little girl who pestered Fan Xian to fight. Could Fan Xian still be her teacher? Chapter 482. Walk with me. Fan Xian extended his right arm and made an inviting gesture. Yi Ling stared at his face in a daze. Shortly after, she smiled and turned her head to glance at the room in the corner of the courtyard. With a teasing smile, she said, "Why aren't you in a hurry now?" Fan Xian laughed loudly. "It's just a pee escape." Yi Ling took a few steps forward and walked shoulder to shoulder with him. Tilting her head, she looked at him with her bright eyes and asked curiously, "Teacher, does the conversation in the flower hall make you so uncomfortable?" Hearing the word teacher again, Fan Xian's heart warmed for no reason. After a moment of surprise, a warm smile rose to his face and he replied, "You know me. I'm not used to that kind of situation. How have you been in Jiangnan? Yi Linger pulled back her shoulders and followed by his side. I know something happened on the way back. I should have gone to see you, but... It wasn't that she wanted to say something but stopped. She helplessly closed her mouth. The entire Qing kingdom was guessing the truth behind the attack in the valley, and who the true killer was. Many people had once cast suspicious gazes on the second prince. After Yi Linger learned of the assassination attempt on Fan Xian, she couldn't help but be shocked and worried. She had even privately asked her husband, although she had received the second prince's guarantee, that the valley incident had nothing to do with him. Given the present situation and Yi Linger's Wangfei status, it was indeed not convenient for her to visit the Fan Manor. Fan Xian smiled and very naturally patted her shoulder. I'm a sturdy person. How could something happen to me so easily? The hand he had extended suddenly froze. Fan Xian pulled it back and laughed at himself. She was now married to a Wangfei. His words and actions had to be measured. As the two of them chatted about the situation after they parted, they walked along the path in the manor's winter forest toward the lakeside. Fan Xian quietly said, Wanner hasn't seen you in a while. She's been thinking about you a lot these days. Before Lin Wanner and Yi Linger married, they were the best of friends in the boudoir. However, now that they had separately married the two people in the younger generation of the Qing kingdom, who could not coexist with each other, it was inevitable that there would be great trouble. Yi Linger sadly said, I also miss her. She usually comes to the manor to play when she has nothing to do. Fan Xian said warmly. If it's not convenient for you to leave the manor, I'll take her to the manor to see you. Yi Linger sighed and stopped beside a bare winter tree. Gazing at Fan Xian, she faintly asked, Teacher, I really don't understand you men, including him. You all speak so similarly. It makes people who listen always think that there has never been anything between you. The he in this sentence was naturally referring to the second prince. Fan Xian smiled and said, What does men fighting to the death have to do with the friendship of you girls? No problem. Yi Linger had a straightforward personality. She raised her face and said, Do you think that if one of us becomes a widow, we can still talk as freely as before? Fan Xian was startled. A moment later he forced a smile and said, Then what do you think? Yi Linger stood silently by the tree and sighed after a long time. She knew that there were many things that could not be changed according to her wishes. As a daughter of the Yi family, in the days before she married, she could wear a red dress like fire and ride a horse through the long streets, letting the people of Jingdo be familiar with her face. She did not care at all what the officials would say, or what her father would be angry about, because she was Yi Linger. But what was Yi Linger to the entire Qing kingdom? I saw your great-uncle in Jiangnan. Fan Xian smiled slightly and changed the topic. He warned. However, not many people know about this matter, so don't spread it. I know. Yi Linger was slightly surprised. What did that old man go to Jiangnan for? Now it was Fan Xian's turn to be surprised. No matter what, your great-uncle is a great-grandmaster. You just call him that? Yi Linger pursed her lips and said, He hangs around outside every year. Occasionally, he comes home without bringing anything good. I call him old man. What objection could he have? Fan Xian smiled. Through Yi Linger's words, he confirmed the closeness between Yi Luyan and the Yi family. Although Yi Luyan traveled the world in name, he certainly returned home many times. Otherwise, the young Yi Linger would not call him so intimately. After you married, did you throw away your martial arts? Fan Xian asked quietly. Yi Linger chuckled. She didn't know whether or not her teacher was preparing to test her. But under the current circumstances, Fan Xian still didn't keep his distance to avoid her. This put her in a good mood, and her eyes shone with eagerness. Fan Xian pretended not to see this expression. He minded his own business, and left the lonely winter tree, walking toward the side of the lake in front. The two of them had already made a large circle, and arrived at the other corner of the cold lake. They could faintly see a corner of the flower hall not far away hidden by the winter tree. With a swoosh, a gust of cold wind came from behind him. It quickly and sinisterly stabbed toward the back of Fan Xian's ear. Fan Xian did not turn his head. He shrugged his right shoulder. The tyrannical Jinchi in his body flowed along the increasingly wide meridians and surged into his right arm. It urged his right arm to naturally struggle. He waved his palm backward. His 5 slender fingers became 5 broken branches. They transformed into a number of afterimages. With incomparable speed and clarity, they tapped on the gust of cold wind behind his head. With a series of crisp smacking sounds, the object in the gust of cold wind was knocked down for no reason. However, Yilinger's reaction was very fast. She threw a punch straight toward the back of Fan Xian's head. Fan Xian did not dare to be careless. With a turn of his toes, his entire body spun around. His palms naturally flipped and blocked in front of him. It was as if 2 large doors had suddenly been erected in front of him, completely blocking the wind from Yilinger's fist. Immediately after, his feet paused. His knees bent slightly, and he forcefully twisted the noiseless kick from below. With a series of thuds, the battle was declared to be over. Fan Xian and Yilinger stood by the lakeside. Their fists and palms intersected. Their legs were also locked together. This posture looked somewhat ambiguous. Fan Xian felt the bouncing sensation from the side of his knees. Very naturally, his heart swayed slightly, and a few other feelings arose. He coughed and separated from Yilinger. He smiled and said, "Still too slow." Yilinger unwillingly withdrew her unsheathed knife and said, "That's because you were too fast." Fan Xian's gaze unintentionally lowered. He looked at the cute embroidered cotton boots on Yilinger's feet. He imagined that if he had moved a little slower earlier, that little foot would have kicked his lower abdomen. Presumably, it would not have felt good. In the future, don't use this kind of trick. It will ruin your future generations, he teased. Yilinger huffed and said, "Master said that the so-called little tricks are just the 3 words shameless. No wonder this kick didn't hit you. Only now do I understand. You like to use these kinds of sinister tricks. Of course, you can guess my next step." Fan Xian was speechless. When the 2 of them had fought earlier, Yilinger had used Fan Xian's little tricks. What Fan Xian had used was the Yi family's coffin breaker, the simplified version of Great Grandmaster Ye's flowing cloud Sansho. Although Yilinger was a rare 7th-level ace among women, in front of him, she had no room to show off. Yilinger suddenly asked in confusion, "Master, although that stab from behind was a feint, why did you dare to use Sansho to directly deflect it?" Fan Xian glanced at her and laughed unhappily. "Since it was a test, of course you wouldn't use any poison weapons. What was I afraid of? Also, your little tricks weren't vicious enough. In the end, your fists and palms were restrained, and the hairpin on your head could also be used to kill people." Yilinger glared at him. "Then wouldn't it all be gone? This is the great prince's manor. Where am I going to find a servant girl to comb my hair?" Fan Xian laughed loudly and said, "Then there's still a mouth left that can bite people. Is my master a big dog?" Yilinger was a little angry. "As a master, don't you know how to be a little more lenient?" Fan Xian looked at the stubborn girl and couldn't help but think of 2 years ago on the streets of the capital, when he had broken her nose with his fist and made her squat on the ground crying. He laughed happily. After a moment, he suddenly opened his mouth. "In the future, don't call me master. Although I have no objections, you are, after all, a princess." The matter of Yilinger and Fan Xian calling each other master and disciple was, in fact, well known to all the nobles in the capital. They treated it as child's play and didn't pay it much attention. Even Yi Zhong himself had never raised any objections. But now that the situation had changed, and Yilinger's status was even more noble, Fan Xian's suggestion was a matter of course. Yilinger didn't like it, and said in a huff, "So what if I call you master? If that doesn't work, then you can call me master. In any case, the Yi family Sansho cannot be taught to outsiders." Fan Xian stopped and smiled bitterly. He knew that Yilinger was speaking the truth. He had learned the coffin breaker from her, and he had truly taken advantage of her. He couldn't say anything more to distance himself from her. The 2 of them walked along the lakeside. Ever since Yilinger had become a princess, she had never had the opportunity to go out in public and fight with others for fun. Today, she had occasionally fought with her master. Although it was only for a moment, she was still unusually excited. With great difficulty she calmed her emotions. After a moment she suddenly said, "Master, my father has also returned to the capital." Fan Xian was startled. He understood what she was reminding him of. The people in the old military all hate you now. Yilinger looked at him with a not quite there smile. Fan Xian shook his head and smiled bitterly. No matter how valiant his power was, as long as the military still stood against him, and the Yi and Qin families were still alive, he would not be able to deal a fundamental blow to the second prince. He would also not be able to completely eliminate the second prince's strong desire to take the throne. Yi Zhong had only returned to the capital to report on his duties, but he, as well as Yi Luyan behind him, had already become the second prince's pillars because of his relationship with Yilinger. It's not easy to stop for a few days. I don't want to hear any more bad news from your mouth. Yilinger was silent for a moment and then said seriously, "Master, no matter what, I am still a lady of the Yi family. I will stand on my father's and his side." Fan Xian paused and thought for a long time. He then said very seriously, "That is something that should be done. Believe me, I am speaking from the bottom of my heart." A glimmer of sadness appeared in Yilinger's eyes. She knew that Fan Xian's words came from the bottom of his heart. She also knew that it was difficult for their positions to soften. "You see, the ice on the surface of the lake will eventually melt." Fan Xian suddenly smiled and said, "Who says the matters of this world are so certain?" Yilinger's face broke into a smile. Her eyes emitted a clear and joyful light like jade. She nodded her head heavily. Not far across the lake was the flower hall with its windows open. It could be seen that a few people were chatting inside. Fan Xian pointed in that direction and teased Yilinger beside him. "We are strolling on this side of the lake. It is really not proper. If the people in the pavilion saw us, who knows what they would say?" Although the customs of the Qin kingdom were open, it was not appropriate for men and women to be alone. Yilinger looked slightly embarrassed. Fan Xian continued to tease her. "Do you think the second prince is already exploding with anger? And he still has to maintain that shy and calm smile on his face? Don't forget, you also smile like a ghost every day." Yilinger was angry. "Also think about what Wanner is thinking. Wanner is a good person." Fan Xian sighed. "She always urges me to find a few sisters to accompany her." After these words came out, Fan Xian cursed in his heart. This teasing had already exceeded the limits between teacher and disciple. Other than the ambiguity, there was also a bit of impetuousness. She was no longer the virgin girl of the past. She was a Wang Fei who was already married. As expected, Yilinger paused for a moment before understanding what he was saying. After her shock, she became angry. She clenched her fist and hammered it toward his head. Fan Xian knew that his habitual hooligan habits had flared up. He felt very ashamed. He did not dare to fight back. Turning into a stray dog, he ran along the side of the lake in a panic, wanting to hide in the flower hall. In the flower hall, the narrow window that was half the height of a person was open. The cold wind from the lake blew in, but it was turned into a fresh and pleasant spring air by the warm cage. The men and women of the royal family in the hall were chatting about interesting things from their childhood. Later, someone rushed to notice the man and woman on the other side of the lake. The great Wang Fei smiled slightly and said, "Look, what are they doing?" The great prince raised his gaze and looked over. His expression changed slightly. Shortly after, he smiled and explained, "That kid has always considered himself to be Linger's teacher. I'm afraid he's teaching someone a lesson again." The great Wang Fei smiled and glanced at the second prince's expression out of the corner of her eye. Li Hongqing was holding a cup of wine. Drunkenly, he moved closer to the window and saw the scene of Fan Xian and Yilinger standing and talking by the lake. He couldn't help but smile and say, "These two are both barbarians. Don't look at how nice they are talking at this time. Who knows, they might start fighting in a moment." Rojia also moved closer to look with interest. She said enviously, "I also want to learn martial arts from Brother Xian, but he won't let me. How unfair." Everyone in the flower hall was looking at the young man and woman on the other side of the lake. Only the second prince and Lin Wanner were together eating desserts and talking quietly. It seemed that they did not care at all what was happening over there. The great Wang Fei turned her head to look at this scene. She couldn't help but have a strange feeling in her heart. Did these two not have any thoughts? The great prince looked at the other side of the lake and shook his head. In a low voice he said, "The girl of the Yi family is married, but she still likes to cause trouble everywhere. Second prince, you have to control her in the manner. This Fan Xian is also too much." He didn't like it, but he didn't want to say much. The second prince was squatting on a chair and slowly chewing on an osmanthus cake. He said indistinctly, "What is there to control? After being cooped up in the manor for a year, this girl has gone crazy from wanting to beat people up. Fan Xian is just right here to be a sandbag, so I won't be taken advantage of in the manor." Beside him, Lin Wana nodded and said, "Two adults, yet they are born with childish tempers. When do they not end up fighting each other when they meet? Don't worry about them. Let them fight. In a moment, they will fight back." Hearing these words, the great prince and his wife looked at each other and thought, what kind of explanation was this? After the words were spoken, everyone turned their heads to look again. They saw that a fight had indeed broken out on the other side of the lake. Yi Linger had her fists clenched and was chasing Fan Xian as he fled wretchedly. The great prince couldn't help but smile. He thought that the son of heaven's family could actually have the noisiness and fun of a normal family. Having Fan Xian and Yi Linger, these two unconventional people, was not necessarily a bad thing. The fighting became boring after watching for a while. Everyone returned to their conversation. The second prince accepted the handkerchief Wanner handed him and carelessly wiped his hands. Suddenly, he asked with great interest, "Princess, I have always been curious. The emperor of your country, just what kind of person is he?" Fan Xian was not the only one who thought carefully. It was clear that the great Wang Fei also liked being called the second prince's brother. She smiled slightly and said a few words. When Fan Xian fled wretchedly back to the flower hall, the great Wang Fei was talking about the interesting stories of the Northern Qi emperor. Her words traveled out the door and startled him. Chapter 483. Recommending a new book, Blessings in a Foreign Land. The purpose of this book is to let the other world taste Chinese delicacies, to lead the other world toward civilization, step by step, to lead the other world toward the four modernizations. The book number is 100-8618. Please support me. Thank you very much. The emperor likes to watch people plant flowers and see the scenery. Oh, isn't that very similar to Uncle's interests? He is very lazy. He just wants to look. Who would dare to let him personally do it? I heard that Haitang likes to be close to the fields. There was an awkward silence. The emperor is a very interesting person. The emperor actually often does many interesting things. However, ever since he was young, Mother pulled him up by the ear to learn the ways of governing a country. We rarely get to see him. In the flower hall, the great Wang Fei's faint smiling voice rang out occasionally. Fan Xian stood outside the door and listened quietly. He knew that what this woman said was not false. A dozen years ago, there had been an upheaval in the Northern Qi royal family. No one knew how many nobles had been involved, including Lady Shun's father, Shen Zhong, who was now hiding in the Yin Manor. Back then, it was because of this matter that he had made a name for himself. The Northern Qi Empress Dowager only had one son, the current Northern Qi Emperor. The other princesses were all born to the previous Northern Qi Emperor's concubines. Although the great princess who had married into the Qing kingdom was respected by the Empress Dowager and the Emperor, she was, after all, not their own. There was always some distance between them. Furthermore, after experiencing the tragic experience of trying to survive while holding her son, the Northern Qi Empress Dowager was wary of other children of the royal family. The people of the Qing kingdom were all curious about the Northern Qi Emperor. At this moment they asked questions endlessly. However, the Wang Fei could not give any details. She only vaguely said it was interesting and interesting. Yi Ling saw him eavesdropping outside the door and glanced at him curiously. Fan Xian smiled and pushed open the door to enter. The great Wang Fei, who had been frowning and troubled, saw the two of them enter. She let out a breath and said, "It's best if you don't ask me. I really can't figure out our emperor. Usually, I can't be bothered to see him in the palace. When he was young, The Empress Dowager watched him very closely. When he grew up, he was busy with national affairs. On the other hand, Fan Xian has traveled with the emperor many times in northern Qi. The emperor has always liked him very much. If you want to ask about something interesting, why don't you ask him? At that moment, Fan Xian and Yi Ling returned to their seats. Yi Ling moved closer to Lin Wan, her face agitated. In a low voice, she spoke of how much she missed Lin Wan. She paid no attention to what the others were saying. Fan Xian and the second prince looked at each other and smiled helplessly. They did not notice that someone had mentioned their names. Hearing the great Wang Fei's words, everyone remembered that other than Wang Fei, the only other person at the banquet who had seen the Northern Qi Emperor was Fan Xian. Everyone knew that the emperor thought very highly of Fan Xian's poetic talent. The crown prince Li Hongcheng gave a hiccup and looked at Fan Xian. And gee, just what kind of person is the Northern Qi Emperor? Fan Xian paused and came to his senses. The ruler of a country is not someone a foreign official, can discuss. Only after these words were said did everyone in the hall feel awkward. In front of the great Wang Fei, it was indeed not appropriate to rashly discuss the gossip of the Northern Qi Emperor. However, the curiosity of humans was always hard to suppress. Everyone, including the second prince, urged Fan Xian to say a few more words. Fan Xian scratched his head and asked, "Why are you so interested in the Northern Qi Emperor?" The men in the reception hall suddenly became silent, their faces revealing embarrassment. Only the three girls were whispering to each other, like ants gnawing on leaves. The great Wang Fei smiled and shook her head. Lifting the hem of her dress slightly, she left the flower hall with a tranquil expression. She said she was going to see how the arrangements for the lunch banquet were going. Given Wang Fei's status, there was no need for her to personally worry about such chores. Without question, she wanted to give these members of the Qing Kingdom's royal family a convenient place to speak. As expected, after Wang Fei walked far into the flower hall, the great prince shook his head and said, "We have to pay attention. The Northern Qi Emperor has always been mysterious and ruthless. Neither the Overwatch Council nor the military reports have any detailed descriptions. His temperament, hobbies, and joy and anger are like a mystery. So what? As an emperor, he has to maintain his mystery in front of his people." Fan Xian replied with a smile. The great prince said seriously, "But he is the ruler of a foreign country. The more mysterious he is in front of us, the more terrifying he is." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "He is just a young man. How can he be so terrifying?" When he had first met the Northern Qi Emperor in Shangjing, he had thought he was a young man about the same age as him. After he returned to the country, he carefully examined the reports and found that this emperor was actually 2 years younger than him. When he was in Jiangnan, every time he thought of the Northern Qi Emperor's deep and far-sighted plans, and how he had used the treasury's silver to participate in the Qing Kingdom's internal affairs without batting an eyelid, Fan Xian's heart palpitated. However, this matter involved his greatest secret, so he did not dare speak of it in the flower hall. The second prince put down the fruit in his hand and sighed. Terrifying has nothing to do with age. He glanced at Fan Xian, meaning to say that when he first entered Jingdo, he was only a 16 or 17 youth, yet he was terrifying. Shortly after, he smiled slightly and said, "You should know about the matter of Shen Zhong of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard. In the end, Wei Hua became the commander. Shen Zhong died a wretched death, but the little emperor waved his hand and turned the entire matter around. He trapped Shang Shanhu in Jingdo and could not leave. He also successfully took over the power of the Empress Dowager's side. Wei Hua doesn't even listen to the Empress Dowager's wishes anymore. Imperial advisor Ku He also maintains his silence. Such a young emperor, where did he get such deep shrewdness? How was he able to convince so many people to stand on his side?" The second prince's tone became heavier. If the battle between the emperor and empress of Northern Qi develops into a fierce situation, then it will be a blessing for the Qing kingdom. We had originally thought that when the emperor took over the government, he would not be able to compare to the Northern Qi Empress Dowager, who had been in power for a long time. In the end, given the young people's violent temperament, I'm afraid that the Northern Qi court would fall into chaos. Who would have thought that this little emperor would quietly take back power in his hands? This kind of method is truly terrifying. Fan Xian fell silent. He was very clear about the inside story of Shenzhong's death. He had even suggested this matter to the Northern Qi emperor through Haitong's mouth. The atmosphere in the flower hall was slightly tense. The three girls knew that the men were talking about national affairs, so they tactfully kept their mouths shut. The crown prince Li Hongcheng no longer had any excess drunkenness in his eyes. He furrowed his brows and said, "The Northern Qi emperor is the ruler of a country. He does not like women, nor does he have any bad habits. He is clear-headed and self-controlled. This kind of person is the most terrifying. In the future, if the Qing kingdom wants to send an army north, the first thing to consider is not the strength of Northern Qi, but the nature of the ruler of Northern Qi. If the Northern Qi emperor does not fall into chaos, there is nothing we can do on our side." After these words were said, the great prince and the second prince both nodded. Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. Looking at this scene, he felt astonished. He was shocked by the serious expressions of the three royal disciples. For a moment he couldn't speak. Only now did he understand that for him, Northern Qi was only a partner. For the nobility of the younger generation of the Qing kingdom, Northern Qi was destined to be flattened and swallowed up by the Qing court. The Qing kingdom loved martial arts. The people of the previous generation had already conquered a large piece of land. What was left to the people of the new generation was the large but not rigid Northern Qi. This was a fanaticism that was deeply rooted in the blood. Regardless of whether it was the great prince or Li Hongcheng, neither could shake off this fanaticism. Even a gentle and solemn character like the second prince could not forget attacking Northern Qi. The Qing kingdom was powerful and had maintained the momentum of attack for 30 years. For the people of the Qing kingdom, this was no longer a problem to consider. The only thing they needed to consider was when to attack Northern Qi. So, what kind of person the Northern Qi emperor was a very important matter for the three royal disciples in the hall. Looking at the second prince's thoughtful expression, it was clear that to be able to unify the world was the ultimate goal of the Qing kingdom. It could even temporarily suppress his anxiety about the dragon chair. Everyone says that the Northern Qi emperor does not like women, but last time, he specifically wanted to swap Sea Lily back to Northern Qi. And Ji, you were the envoy last time. Did you discover any details in Shangjing? The great prince asked seriously. Fan Xian slowly said after a moment. It is true that he does not like women. In the vast royal palace, there are only a few secondary concubines. In order to prevent the power of the extended relatives from growing, the young emperor forcefully resisted the pressure of the large families in Shangjing. The concubines he chose were all commoners. Strangely, the Empress Dowager did not seem to oppose this arrangement. The second prince furrowed his brows and said, "Even if it is to prevent the power of the extended relatives from growing, this kind of arrangement is not a good idea to appease the officials. It is not appropriate." Fan Xian nodded and pretended to be worried. Just as Wang Fei said earlier, the emperor is truly difficult to see through. He is clearly right in front of you, but I always feel that there is a very clever disguise on him. Li Hongqing laughed. Come on, the emperor has been very honest with you. Earlier, you said you were a foreign official. I don't think the Northern Qi people see you as a foreign official. Otherwise, after the assassination, why would they send a letter of credence to Jingdo to protest? The great prince shook his head angrily. The Northern Qi people have bullied me too much. They actually played such a trick. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Your Highness, this matter has nothing to do with me. Speaking of the assassination, the second prince was not at all embarrassed. With a selfless and open-minded appearance, he teased Fan Xian. Of course, this matter has nothing to do with you. Putting aside the fact that you are a Qing person, Northern Qi only wants to provoke you. Even if the little emperor likes you and pulls you to Northern Qi, would he marry his sister to you? At this moment Yi Linger interrupted. I think that might be the case. Fan Xian was born with a good appearance, and the Northern Qi emperor is a fanatic of him. With these words, the serious discussion became a joke. Fan Xian's lips curled into a smile, and he calmly watched the conversation between the men and women. They talked about interesting things in the palace. Fan Xian didn't know much about them. Gradually, he had the illusion of being excluded from the atmosphere. Speaking of which, before he entered Jingdo, the men and women in the flower hall had watched each other grow up. The relationship between the younger generation of the Qing royal family had always been good. He had always been an outsider. However, Fan Xian did not immerse himself too much in these emotions. Because of the discussion earlier about the Northern Qi Emperor, he sank deep into thought. He faintly felt that he was about to catch onto something mysterious. In his mind, he went through the circumstances of his meeting with the Northern Qi Emperor and Shangjing in detail. He then carefully reviewed the year and a half, the tacit cooperation between him and the Northern Qi Emperor, complemented by the Northern Qi Emperor's aesthetic tastes and the little details of his life. A light gradually almost rushed out of his mind. However, it couldn't rush out. Fan Xian was still in a daze amidst the faint fragrance. The people beside him had all quieted down and looked at him, but he still hadn't noticed. Fan Xian abruptly realized he had lost composure. He smiled awkwardly and unconsciously said, "Smells so good. Smells so good." A faint fragrance filled the flower hall. Fan Xian was slightly dazed, and it was as if there was some kind of magic at the tip of his nose that made him dazed again. This fragrance was actually very light and elegant, but for him, it was very rich, and it was so shocking. Turning his head, he saw that the great Wang Fei had long returned. She had already changed clothes. Fan Xian forced a smile and asked, "Where did the fragrance come from?" The great Wang Fei was slightly surprised. Shortly after, she smiled. "I didn't think that not only are you exceptionally intelligent, but your mind and nose are also so exquisite. I've worn this fragrance bag for a year, and the prince has never smelled it. Today, I've just put it on, and you smelled it." Everyone looked at Fan Xian curiously. Yi Linger sniffed, but didn't smell any special fragrance. It was just that the incense burning in the flower hall was swept by the cold wind on the lake. It was very faint. "Isn't it incense?" Yi Linger asked curiously. Wang Fei smiled and said, "Of course it isn't incense." She took out a small and exquisite fragrance bag from her waist and said, "I brought it from Shangjing." Fan Xian had a strong urge to hold the fragrance bag in his hand and sniff it carefully. However, the fragrance bag was something a woman wore close to her body. It had a deep meaning. No matter what, he could not make such a request. Hearing Wang Fei's words, his expression had already calmed. He smiled and said, "They've never been to Northern Qi, so they can't smell this faint fragrance. I've been there. No wonder I can smell it." Wang Fei smiled and shook her head. "I bet you've also never smelled it. You've been to the royal palace in Shangjing. Have you been to the back of the mountain?" Fan Xian nodded. Wang Fei said, "What's in this fragrance bag is a golden osmanthus flower. The golden osmanthus flower is on the mountain. There should only be one in the entire world. This golden osmanthus flower's fragrance is very faint. If one didn't pay attention, one wouldn't be able to smell it no matter what." Fan Xian smiled and said, "When I went up the mountain, I only stayed for a short while in the pavilion by the stream. I didn't see this rare golden osmanthus flower. It grows on the summit of the mountain." The great Wang Fei smiled and said, "It's an isolated species that the imperial advisor personally transplanted from the northern lands. Additionally, the fragrance isn't very strong, so no one has ever collected its stamen and used it as a fragrance bag. Thus, I dare to say that even if Sir Fan Jr. had stayed in the palace, you still wouldn't have smelled it." Fan Xian asked in surprise, "Then Wang Fei, your fragrance bag?" Everyone was a bit confused. Why was Fan Xian constantly thinking about this fragrance bag and constantly asking about it? Fan Xian was also afraid of giving himself away, so he smiled and explained, "I like this fragrance. I want to give one to Wan Er." Lin Wan Er smiled slightly. She knew that her husband was certainly not thinking like this. However, the bystanders did not understand. The great imperial prince said disapprovingly, "How can a man put his mind on these women's matters?" The great Wang Fei glared at him and said, "To be able to mount a horse and embroider flowers, that is a true man." The great prince immediately closed his mouth. The great Wang Fei turned toward Fan Xian and smiled. I'm afraid it won't be easy for you to give one to Princess Chen. No, it may not be easy for other people, but you have the chance. Write a letter to the emperor and ask for it. This emperor was the emperor of Northern Qi. Fan Xian smiled warmly and said, Was the one on Princess's body also bestowed by the emperor of your country? Yes. A trace of homesickness appeared in Wang Fei's eyes. She lightly said, In the past in Shangjing, only the emperor wore a fragrance bag with golden osmanthus flowers. He said he liked this kind of light and refreshing smell. The night before I left the capital, the emperor bestowed the fragrance bag. He always carried on his body to me, so that I could remember the taste of my homeland in the south. The atmosphere in the flower hall became slightly sentimental because of Wang Fei's light words. Fan Xian's gaze flashed across the fragrance bag. He smiled and didn't say anything more. After eating and chatting in the great prince's manor, it was already dusk. During this time, under the great prince's arrangements, Fan Xian and the second prince had another deep conversation in the study. However, the two of them in Baiwa brothel had already talked deeply enough. Presently, the second prince had the Yi family and a great grandmaster behind him, so he would not retreat even half a step. Although Fan Xian knew that his situation was as the second prince had said, that he appeared to have as much power as a mountain, in reality, he was as precarious as a pile of eggs. However, he was in the world and had no choice. Even if he wanted to withdraw and retreat, it was impossible. At least, the Qing emperor would not allow it. The second prince gave him one last deep glance and slowly said, Anji, there is something I must remind you of. Without question, you are the biggest troublemaker in Qing Kingdom these 2 years. You know what happened back then. Why did father allow you to live and grow up in Danzhou, and not simply clean up all the trouble? Fan Xian lowered his head slightly, and thought that the second prince was indeed a powerful figure, who was very good at persuading people. If one did not consider Uncle Wu Zhu's threat to the emperor, the Qing emperor's secret protection of his growth could only mean one thing. Although the emperor was heartless, he would always have some pity for his children. Father would not allow us brothers to do anything too intense. The second prince looked at him and said quietly. The second prince looked at him and quietly said, But for you, if the situation cannot be intensified, you can only sit and watch the water flow east. The situation is worsening day by day. This is where your problem lies. Fan Xian smiled slightly and thought that the situation was about to intensify. If he wanted to protect everything he had, it would require other people to bear an unbearable price. Regardless of life and death, Fan Xian looked at the second prince and said seriously, regardless of life and death had 2 layers of meaning. One was that life and death had to be distinguished. The other was that it was only about fighting, and did not involve each other's lives. The second prince raised his hand, and gave Fan Xian a light clap. In the afternoon, the Overwatch Council suddenly sent news, saying that there were strange movements in Xi Lake. The military intelligence had already been sent to the Bureau of Military Affairs. The palace summoned Fan Xian for an audience. As the commander of the imperial army, the great prince had no choice but to leave. The second prince, and Li Hongqing could still stay in the manor. Fan Xian had his wife and Yi Ling, talk a bit longer. He left the manor alone and sat in his own carriage. Without waiting for the great prince, he ordered the carriage to slowly move along the snow-covered streets of Jingdou. The matter in Xi Lake was not urgent. It would take at least a month for news to travel between the 2 places. There was no need to rush into the palace at this time. Fan Xian needed time to digest what he had encountered today. The black carriage circled a few times on the streets of Jingdou, and drove onto a relatively quiet street. Sitting in the driver's seat, Teng Zijing watched his surroundings cautiously. There were unremarkable secret agents in disguise around the front, back, left, and right of the carriage to ensure Fan Xian's safety. Fan Xian closed his eyes and leaned against the back of the chair in the carriage. His face was slightly pale, and the corners of his lips were dry. That faint scent of osmanthus. So that night's scent was the scent of osmanthus. He thought of that night, that temple, that field, and the belt he hadn't had time to tie properly. But it was clearly sea lily, It was sea lily. Only that scent before he woke up, that pair of hands that had rubbed his temples? His thin lips trembled a little. In a low voice, he quickly cursed a few profanities. Unconsciously, he slammed his palm against the board of the carriage beside him. With a loud bang, Fan Xian slammed his palm down heavily in a rage. The abundant tyrannical zhenqi in his body surged out. Wherever the wind from his palm touched, it was unstoppable. In just an instant, the quiet street was filled with the sound of wood shattering. The black carriage looked like it was made of paper. Half of it was destroyed by the blow. The wheels were broken, the carriage was overturned, and the horses were startled. Teng Zijing turned pale with fright, and barely managed to stand his ground. The dust gradually settled. Fan Xian, dressed in black official robes, stood absent-mindedly among the wood and gravel on the ground. Beside him, Tiger Guard Gao Da's long knife was half unsheathed. His eyes flashed wildly as he tried to find traces of the assassin. 7 or 8 swordsmen of the 6th Bureau were scattered around, gripping the metal drills at their waists tightly. The crossbows in their left hands were aimed at the outside. Chapter 484. Also, it is the end of the month. As usual, I extended my hand sincerely to ask for a monthly ticket. Yesterday, I really didn't peep at anything. I just watched everyone laugh, and I was also very happy. At the beginning, I was going to write this part to make it more interesting, and then reveal the truth. I was afraid the plot would be too slow. Everyone knows that I have always been very long-winded. It is a bad habit that is difficult to change. I heard that the tickets for May will double. I am here to reserve tickets for next month. Please vote for me tomorrow. However, there may be an annual meeting next month. After the meeting, I will have to go far away. The updates may be a bit messy, so I am here to report to everyone. Gao Da confirmed that there were no enemies around. Somewhat dejectedly, he returned the long knife to its sheath. The blade scraped against the opening of the sheath with a dry ringing sound. The black-robed swordsman of the 6th Bureau beside him, and the secret agents disguised as passers-by not far away reported back at almost the same time. There was nothing strange. Fan Xian's subordinates stared at him with a strange gaze. They didn't know what had happened in the carriage in that instant. Teng Zijing cleared out the wood and gravel wheels in front of him, and carefully prepared to help him up. Fan Xian shook his head, and waved his hand to indicate that he was fine. Only then did he realize that his subconscious anger had brought so much rubbish to this quiet long street, and also brought so much trouble to his subordinates. Gao Da carried the long knife on his back and walked to his side. In a small voice he asked, "Sir, what happened?" "Nothing." Fan Xian laughed bitterly, and raised his foot to walk forward. The Overwatch Council was very efficient. Before long, another brand new black carriage came from the corner of the street, and stopped in front of everyone. Teng Zijing rubbed his legs, which had gone soft from the fright. He prepared to take the reins when Fan Xian scolded him. "You're so scared. Go back and rest." Teng Zijing smiled, and made a sound of acknowledgement. He handed the reins to Mu Fenger. Without orders, people began to clean up the mess on the street, so as not to disturb the people of Jingdo. The carriage began to move again. Fan Xian sat in the carriage deep in thought, and still didn't say a word. Mu Fenger drove the carriage along the quiet street. The more he walked, the more anxious he felt. He couldn't resist turning his head and saying through the cotton curtain, "Sir, the palace is pressing you." There was an edict for Fan Xian to enter the palace to discuss matters. But Fan Xian sat in a carriage and strolled the streets. The person who had gone to Prince Hutching's manor to deliver the edict was Mu Fenger. He knew that no matter how arrogant Sir Fan Jr. was, the emperor and the palace would probably not bear to reprimand him. But what about him? So he gathered his courage and began to urge her. At this moment, Fan Xian did not care about she who or the royal palace. His mind was filled with the lawsuit. He shouted, "I am thinking about something, don't bother me." The people around the carriage looked at each other, feeling very strange. They did not understand why the commissioner was in such a bad mood today. In the eyes of the officials under heaven, the Overwatch Council Commissioner Fan Xian was a man who appeared gentle on the outside, but was sinister and ruthless in his methods. In the eyes of the internal members of the Overwatch Council, Sir Fan Jr. was an extremely lenient, generous, and magnanimous superior. Fan Xian didn't even say a harsh word to his trusted aides in his daily work, let alone cursing out loud. Thus everyone felt strange. They didn't know what had caused Sir Fan Jr. to lose his composure like this. However, no one dared to ask. The carriage did not go straight into the royal palace. Instead, under Fan Xian's insistence, it came to the Overwatch Council. He stepped out of the carriage with 3 thumping steps. Without even glancing at the square, black-gray building, he walked inside. Along the way, he occasionally met Overwatch Council officials who were out on business. Seeing the baleful expression on the commissioner's face, they all jumped in fright and quickly moved to the side to bow. Just as he was about to enter the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian suddenly stopped his steps. He had stopped too abruptly. Gao Da and Mu Feng, who were behind him, did not react in time and almost bumped into each other. Fan Xian didn't look at them. He only twisted his neck and turned his head to the back, trying his best to reach out. It was as if he wanted to see something strange behind him. For a person to want to turn their head to look at their buttocks was a very difficult action. Even with the agility of a 9th-level ace like Fan Xian, he still found it difficult. His neck was a bit sore. His body naturally reacted and began to circle where he stood. It was as if the buttocks covered by the black official robes were ashamed to meet his gaze and were trying their best to escape. Turning his head to look at his buttocks, he circled where he stood. Circle after circle. Fan Xian's action was truly too preposterous and comical. This was the front door of the Overwatch Council. He was the high and mighty commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Yet he was like a cat endlessly circling in a vain attempt to see his tail. To the side, Gao Da and Mu Feng watched this scene with their mouths wide open. The corners of their eyes began to twitch. They were speechless. They wanted to laugh but didn't dare. They didn't know what Fan Xian was playing at. The officials inside and outside the front door of the Overwatch Council were also in a daze as they watched this scene. They all turned into countless clay statues and watched dumbfoundedly as the commissioner spun in circles. However, it was completely silent. The valiant nerves of the Overwatch Council officials allowed them to maintain their silence. They didn't know if the commissioner, who had suddenly become crazy, was testing them or not. With great difficulty, Gao Da closed his lips and looked at Fan Xian. He wondered if the young master had been with the young master of the Lin family for too long and had also become somewhat stupid. Fan Xian suddenly stopped his whirling dance and stood where he was. Although he had only spun a few times, for the people at the side who saw this scene, the few circles of time made them feel as if a day had passed like a year. Fan Xian stood where he was in a daze. He then suddenly extended a finger to point behind him and asked Gao Da, "Has my walking posture ever changed?" "No." Gao Da shook his head in confusion. Fan Xian's heart calmed slightly. He sighed and scratched his head. He then said, "I also feel that everything is normal." Gao Da and Mu Feng didn't understand. Fan Xian suddenly shivered and furrowed his brows in disgust. Wiping his sweaty hands carelessly in front of his robes, he walked into the courtyard. After the figures of the 3 of them disappeared from the great hall of the front door of the Overwatch Council, the Overwatch Council officials, who had turned into clay statues, came back to life. They all felt that it was absurd. They looked at each other and saw the mirth in each other's eyes. A wave of discussion suddenly rang out. Fan Xian didn't know that his loss of composure had brought endless topics of conversation to the Overwatch Council subordinates on this boring winter day. He wasn't in the mood to pay attention to these questions. He directly entered the secret room and didn't greet the confused Yin Bingyan. Instead, he had him bring over the Northern Intelligence files for this year and a half. The second bureau moved quickly. In less than 15 minutes, the small mountain of Northern Intelligence files had been piled on the table in the secret room. Fan Xian waved his hand and rudely asked Yin Bingyan to leave. Yin Bingyan furrowed his brows. He could see that Fan Xian was uneasy. He walked out of the room and asked Gao Da and Mu Feng in a quiet voice, but he didn't get any clues. One by one, the dossiers were opened and closed. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and sank deep into thought. Most of these files involved stories and news from the royal palace in Shangjing. In the past, Fan Xian had already read most of the content, particularly the parts that involved the Northern Qi Emperor. They were the most important to him. In the past, it had been very difficult to analyze the Northern Qi Emperor's personality from these messy and disorderly intelligence reports. Now, Fan Xian already had his own guesses and judgments about the Northern Qi Emperor. It was much easier to find clues based on this. It was always easier to make bold assumptions and carefully verify them. With a goal in front of him, it was always easier. In a moment, Fan Xian had, through his own guesses, strung together the countless details in the old files and gradually approached that absurd truth. The truth that was enough to shock the world, make countless people's heads fall to the ground, and make Fan Xian depressed and uneasy. It was written clearly in these files that the Northern Qi Emperor had been raised by the Empress Dowager. Even his personal nannies had never been changed. For a dozen years, it had always been the same two people. For an emperor to only have two nannies and very few serving girls, it was truly a far cry from Northern Qi's extravagant style. The Northern Qi Empress Dowager's explanation was that back then, the Wei Kingdom had toppled the country with grandiosity, so she had to teach the emperor to be accustomed to a simple and plain life from a young age. Everyone thought that the Northern Qi Emperor was not interested in women, those 4 secondary concubines from ordinary families. At this moment, in Fan Xian's eyes, it was enough to explain many things. Just as the second prince had said in Prince Huqing's manner, for the ruler of a country, the harem was a marvelous weapon for stabilizing the balance of the court. Logically speaking, it was impossible for him not to make the children of the officials in court concubines. This was a somewhat stupid action, but Fan Xian only now knew that this was the mother and son. No mother and daughter in the Northern Qi Palace who had no other choice. If the Northern Qi Emperor married the daughter of an official, but was never able to have sexual intercourse, this news would naturally spread to the nobility and cause some people to speculate. Furthermore, even if they could not have sexual intercourse, they would still have to sit across from each other and lie together. The daughters of the officials would always find something strange. Only by marrying the daughters of commoners could he completely control all of this. Even with the Qing Overwatch Council's all-pervasive intelligence-gathering methods, they still could not have a completely detailed description of the Northern Qi Emperor, much less any special characteristics of his body. This was enough to prove how strict the Northern Qi Royal Palace was in protecting the Northern Qi Emperor's body. All of this, under the circumstances that Fan Xian had made up his mind, pointed to a great secret that could not be announced to the world. Not marrying the daughter of an official, and being so careful even when bathing. Other than proving that the Northern Qi Emperor had something difficult to say, it also indirectly comforted Fan Xian a little. The Northern Qi Emperor was not gay. She was a woman. Fan Xian rubbed his slightly sore eyes and raised his head. Leaning against the chair, he seemed to be deep in thought about something. To his right hand was still the intelligence report that Sea Lily had sent through a secret channel. However, there was no need to read it. Since the Northern Qi Emperor was in such a situation, Sea Lily must be well aware of it. Then, the intelligence report that was endlessly sent from Shangjing must be full of exaggeration. Fan Xian's right hand clenched slightly, and then immediately relaxed. A light flashed through his mind. He suddenly thought of the words that Haitang had said in Northern Qi's Shangjing. Us sisters all think this is feasible. A few sisters? A bitter smile appeared at the corners of Fan Xian's lips. A few sisters? The Northern Qi Emperor, Haitang Duoduo and Sea Lily. This kind of sister combination was a bit too powerful. However, they played him in the palm of their hands. It was truly infuriating. Was the person with him that night really the Northern Qi Emperor? That faint scent of osmanthus? If it really was the Northern Qi Emperor, why would she take such a great risk to have a night with him? Fan Xian's brows furrowed. He once again buried his head in the files and carefully examined the intelligence reports from the royal palace in Shangjing this year and a half. He was a very self-aware person. Even though he knew that he had the title of immortal poet in this world, that even Zhuang Mohan admired him greatly, that he was born with a good body, that he could write a few sour lines, and that he could say a few witty words. But he did not think that he was a walking aphrodisiac that could attract all the women in the world to worship under his black robe without a care for their lives. Particularly the Northern Qi Emperor. Judging from the cooperation between Jiangnan and the North, she was a very powerful and far-sighted character. It was impossible for her to play such a trick, just because she desired Fan Xian's beauty. As for feelings, although Fan Xian believed in love at first sight, he did not think that an emperor, whose female companion often dressed as a man and lived in vigilance and danger, would be so indulgent. Then there was only one explanation. After sorting through the intelligence reports from the past year and a half, Fan Xian raised his head again with satisfaction. During this year and a half, the Northern Qi Emperor continued to attend court every day. There was no sign of the emperor not attending court in the morning. He did not go out to play, nor did he go to the palace to avoid the heat or go hunting. In short, the Northern Qi Emperor had not left people's sight for more than 2 days. The medicine supply in the Royal Academy of Medicine in Shangjing was also normal. Given Fan Xian's sharp senses for medicine, there was no sign of a pregnancy suppressant. Of course, if the other party had done it in secret, there was nothing he could do. Based on the current situation, it was impossible for the Northern Qi Emperor to be pregnant. This judgment made Fan Xian feel much more relaxed. He unconsciously stood up and stretched his back. What he was most afraid of was having a child with the Northern Qi Emperor after one night with her. It wasn't that he wasn't mentally prepared to be a father. He just wasn't prepared to be the father of an emperor. Particularly, he didn't want to become the object of the other party's seed in such a passive situation. Since no seed had taken root and sprouted, then it didn't matter. The gloom in Fan Xian's heart had long dissipated. Men were often like this. Sexual relations with a woman was really nothing. Even in such a passive situation, he could still comfort himself and enjoy it. Suddenly he thought of Yi Qingmei. The cycle of cause and effect. Retribution is not good. Fan Xian smiled helplessly and thought to himself that he was not as good as his mother. But in one area, he and his mother had finally reached a tie. They had both slept with the same emperor. He unconsciously didn't want to think that his experience was much more wretched than his mother's methods. He heavily patted his slightly numb buttocks and left the Overwatch Council's secret room with some lingering fear and helplessness. Sitting in the carriage heading toward the royal palace, Fan Xian held a special pencil from the palace treasury and thought carefully for a while. He then wrote a line of words on a piece of white paper. "I know what you did last summer." He then sealed the letter and handed it to Mu Feng'er. He had him take it to the little secret courtyard in the west of the city and give it to Wang Qinian. Fan Xian's confidants had long gotten used to the commissioner using the Overwatch Council's secret channels to write love letters to girls in the north. So Mu Feng'er did not find it strange. Fan Xian watched his departing figure and couldn't help but shake his head. Wang Qinian knew who he was writing this letter to. However, this was not a love letter. It wasn't just for Haitang. It was for the 3 girls. He had been tricked by the other party. Now that he had realized it, he was going to use it to obtain some benefits, at least some mental benefits. First, he was going to write a letter and write a line to intimidate the other party. Given the Northern Qi Emperor's intelligence, she would understand what he meant. Fan Xian used 2 fingers to play with the thin end of the pencil. He then put it into the upper pocket of his robe and shook his head. Suddenly he thought of something. Before the great princess left, the Northern Qi Emperor had personally presented her with the golden osmanthus flower sachet. Given her intelligence and meticulous mind, would she not guess what this unique fragrance in the world would make him guess? He furrowed his brows and thought to himself, could it be that the once-in-a-lifetime female emperor also had some concern for me deep in her heart and couldn't bear to hide it forever? So she found a way to remind him? He felt that he was thinking too much. He sighed and stopped thinking about it. In his heart, he thought, I should have guessed long ago that someone so obsessed with the story of the stone can't be a man. The royal study was already full of people. Fan Xian stood at the very bottom with an awkward expression. The moment he entered the royal study, he had been thoroughly scolded by the Qing emperor. Naturally, He did not have the special honor of sitting down. Perhaps some of the civil and military officials in the room felt a sense of schadenfreude. But they all knew that the harsher the emperor's scolding was, the more he favored Fan Xian. Thus, none of them dared to show their happiness on their faces. Fan Xian knew he should be scolded. This matter involved military and national affairs. Yet he had delayed entering the palace for so long, and had the palace come looking for him a number of times. He did not know the gravity of the situation, and disregarded national affairs. No wonder the emperor was so angry. However, in Fan Xian's view, although the matter he was investigating was a family matter, it was also a national matter. However, this matter could not be discussed with others. He could only keep it in his heart, and not make a sound as he was scolded. Without a sound, he forgot to ask for forgiveness. Thus, the emperor's expression did not change for the better. With a cold huff, he left him in the cold. The emperor had summoned Fan Xian into the palace with the intention of finding an opportunity for him to come into contact with the Qing kingdom's higher-ups when it came to dealing with sudden incidents. He had the intention of teaching and advising him. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian had come so late. This made the emperor unhappy. The discussion had begun a long time ago. The initial decision was for Yi Zhong to lead the army 300 li to the west and suppress the restless nerves of Shi Hu. At the same time, the northern governor, Yan Xiaoi, was to return north early to resist the arrogance of northern Qi's mighty general Shang Shanhu. There were also some specific logistics issues that Fan Xian didn't hear a word of. He only knew that the emperor had finally fulfilled his promise to him and sent Yan Xiaoi away. As for Yi Zhong, Fan Xian unconsciously raised his head and saw a general sitting second to his right. This general was not tall. On the contrary, he was rather stout. His eyes drooped as if he had no energy. He only occasionally glanced at Fan Xian with a deep gaze. This was Yi Linger's father, the previous commander of the Jingdou garrison, and the present governor of Dingzhou, Yi Zhong. Fan Xian gazed at him and smiled warmly. Suddenly, he heard eunuch Yao reading the edict. He heard about the 7th year of the Qing calendar and so on. His heart jumped. Only now did he remember that it was already past the new year. The erotic story that happened in the little temple should have happened in the summer of the year before last, and not last year. After the emergency meeting in the royal study ended, the emperor kept Fan Xian behind. He no longer scolded him angrily. He only stared at him. Fan Xian knew that he was in the wrong today. It was not good for him to continue acting tough. He forced a smile and asked for forgiveness. The emperor furrowed his brows and said, "Weren't you at Prince Heching's manor earlier? Where did you go afterward?" Fan Xian smiled and replied, "Something urgent suddenly happened in the council, so I rushed over to take care of it." The emperor said unhappily, "What matter can be more urgent than a border threat?" Fan Xian's expression didn't change as he replied, "It was news from the north. Shang Shanhu has received the edict and is heading south. He is already 300 li from Yinjing. However, he is not leading any soldiers." The emperor's expression relaxed slightly. "So that's how it is. It is already rare for the northern Qi emperor to use Shang Shanhu. However, he doesn't even dare to take out a mere 300 soldiers. It looks like his breadth of mind is only SOSO." Fan Xian thought to himself, "There are many people in this world who have been emperors, but there are few who are as perversely confident as you." Immediately after, the emperor asked a few more questions about the gathering at Prince Heching's manor. From his words and manner, it seemed that he was very satisfied with the great prince's actions. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He knew that the second prince was right. Although the emperor had provoked his sons to fight, he still did not want them to suffer unacceptable losses. After saying a few more words, Fan Xian's unease was seen by the emperor and chased him out. Chapter 485. Because there's a rumor in world of martial arts that you can vote for a few more monthly votes. Because there's a rumor in world of martial arts that a single chapter has a great effect in getting monthly votes. That's why I'm here to pay my respects. Chapter 486. Yesterday when I read the comments section, especially one of the posts, I suddenly felt as if I had walked into a war or leisure mood. I was a little scared. I admit that a certain comrade was right. I really don't have any experience. Brother Fan also doesn't have any experience. Sigh. P.S. Still pulling for monthly votes. Don't find it troublesome. I'm preparing to pull for 7 days. I had things to do during the day and didn't have time to write. In the end, I went online and saw that there were so many votes. It is truly exciting and scary. The general was not wearing armor. He also did not carry the longbow on his back. Even so, Fan Xian still lowered his head slightly and narrowed his eyes. Only then was he able to resist the thick arrow intent emanating from the other party's body. Arrows were used to kill, but the arrow intent was not a killing intent. It was a kind of aura that seemed to tear apart a person's outer clothing and reveal the timid and pale skin underneath. Even with Fan Xian's powerful mental control and strength, he was still suppressed by this aura. It meant that this general's cultivation was truly a level higher than his. Northern Governor Yin Xiaoi, an absolute warrior above the 9th level. He was the person most likely to challenge a great grandmaster. Greetings, Governor. Fan Xian piled on a smile and gently bowed toward Yin Xiaoi. Yin Xiaoi stood in the long corridor. The deep gaze in his eyes was like spring water washing over Fan Xian's face. After hearing Fan Xian's words, he did not have any reaction. In a slightly raspy voice he said, I will be returning to the north in a few days. Every time I think of the lanterns hanging high in the sky and the martial conference in the palace, I am truly disappointed that I won't be able to spar with the commissioner. The so-called martial conference was just a boxing match held by the court. This was Fan Xian's understanding. Furthermore, he knew that in such a country where military service and martial power were prized, if Yin Xiaoi truly went crazy and disregarded the emperor's face and challenged him in the palace, would Yin Xiaoi go crazy? Fan Xian knew that the people on the eldest princess side were all crazy, particularly after their only son, Yin Shendu, had been stabbed to death by the cute 13th Wang he had ordered. Could he beat Yin Xiaoi? Fan Xian asked himself. It was impossible for him to spray poison in the hall, and he certainly could not use crossbows. In a direct confrontation of martial arts, he was still some distance away from a top 9th level ace. Although it was impossible for Yin Xiaoi to use his famous bow in the palace, he was not stupid enough to think that all of Yin Xiaoi's extraordinary skills were on that bow. Therefore, if the martial arts discussion became a reality, even if Old Hong could save his life in the end, he would definitely be seriously injured. During the military intelligence conference, the emperor had Yin Xiaoi return to the north early. This was in accordance with Fan Xian's request. After all, he didn't even want to be wounded. But looking at the current situation, Yin Xiaoi's disappointment and anger could not be concealed at all. Fan Xian couldn't resist smiling. He smiled warmly at this powerful figure in the military and said, Governor, I thought you misunderstood something. Yin Xiaoi was silent for a moment, then said, I just want to experience Commissioner Fan's little tricks. Fan Xian was also silent for a moment. He then raised his hands in a salute and said, In these peaceful times it is better to have less fighting and killing. In the long corridor, only Fan Xian and Yin Xiaoi stood facing each other. A sense of danger rose involuntarily. Fan Xian knew that in the royal palace, Yin Xiaoi would not attack no matter what, so he was not very worried. He used his clear eyes to calmly watch the other party. Cough cough. A few coughs rang out. It was not old Eunuch Hong. Rather, it was a slightly short figure with an aura like that of Dong Mountain. He suddenly appeared beside the two of them. Yi Zhong. Fan Xian smiled slightly, thinking that this person had come at just the right time. He did not want to have another clash of gazes with Yin Xiaoi. Governor Yin, Commissioner Fan, this is a restricted area of the palace. Don't make too much noise. When Yi Zhong was in charge of the Jingdo garrison, Fan Xian had not yet been born. Yin Xiaoi was still hunting in the mountains. With his seniority and status, the weight of his words was much greater. Yin Xiaoi paused slightly and turned his head to bow. Fan Xian smiled and asked, Uncle Yi, long time no see. How are you and Dingzhou? With Yi Zhong's interruption, Yin Xiaoi stopped talking. Yi Zhong could also see the problem between Yin Xiaoi and Fan Xian. He furrowed his brows in thought. The death of Yin Xiaoyi's only son had always been an unsolved case. Why was Yin Xiaoyi so certain that Fan Xian did it? I still have official business to attend to, so I'll take my leave now. Fan Xian took this opportunity to quickly escape. Yi Zhong nodded. Yin Xiaoyi slowly said, Sir Fan Jr., you must take care of yourself. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He knew what the other party meant by these words. A heroic feeling surged from the bottom of his heart. He raised his hands to the sky and laughed. With the protection of the heavens, there is no need for Governor Yin to worry. Yin Xiaoyi's smile suddenly became bone-piercingly cold. He stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said each word clearly. The heavens cannot hide from my eyes. Fan Xian, you will die at my hands. Everyone was in the royal palace, and Yi Zhong was still by his side. Yet, Yin Xiaoyi was arrogant enough to say such threatening words. Yi Zhong couldn't help but furrow his brows, but he didn't say anything. Fan Xian looked at this scene, and couldn't help but shake his head. Yi Zhong was the second prince's father-in-law, and had long belonged to that side. However, Yin Xiaoyi did not care about anything in front of him, and said he would kill the emperor's illegitimate son in the royal palace. He was indeed arrogant and crazy to the extreme. He gently brushed his sleeves and raised his face confidently. Yin Xiaoyi, I'm willing to bet that you will die at my hands first, and it will be an incomparably stupid death. After saying this, he raised his hands to Yi Zhong. Without another glance at Yin Xiaoyi, he slowly walked in the direction of the palace gate. Yin Xiaoyi narrowed his eyes, and watched his gradually disappearing figure with extreme coldness. Yi Zhong also watched Fan Xian's figure, and wondered where exactly this young man got his confidence from. He had already made arrangements for a few years. Don't let some unexpected changes happen because of Fan Xian. As he thought this, he turned his head to look at Yin Xiaoyi and sighed. Patting his shoulder, he said, My condolences. However, in the palace, be careful that the walls have ears. After all, he is not a normal person. He is the emperor's son. Yin Xiaoyi's expression did not change. Coldly he said, I also have a son. Walking to the palace gate, Fan Xian's expression had long recovered its calm. Yin Xiaoyi, and he had long been in a life-and-death situation. They just needed a suitable place and time to put it into practice. Last time, the situation he had arranged had been broken by Eunuch Hong. Next time, would he fall into Yin Xiaoyi's trap? There was also 13th Wang. After killing Yin Shendu, he had suddenly disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he had gone. As Fan Xian calculated in his heart, he walked out of the palace. Then, as expected, he saw the great prince beside him, the only military general in the royal family. What did you say to Yin Xiaoyi? The great prince asked in a low voice beside him. His son died, and he's randomly biting people. Fan Xian replied with a smile. He said he wanted to kill me. The great prince furrowed his brows and said with slight anger, What an arrogant tone. Doesn't he see where he is? Fan Xian thought for a moment, and then said seriously to the great prince, Yin Xiaoyi's intention to rebel is set. I don't think the emperor can't see it, but you have to be careful. The great prince was slightly startled. He wondered where the word rebel came from. Fan Xian climbed into the carriage and headed toward the manor. On the way, he was still thinking about this question. The emperor would not be unable to see Yin Xiaoyi's surging desire to fight and kill. Why did he still release the tiger back into the mountains? Wasn't he still imprisoning him in Jingdou? It was an interesting question. He laughed at himself in his heart. Who knew how much later, when Yin Xiaoyi came to kill him, or when he killed Yin Xiaoyi, the world would certainly become very interesting. Presumably, the mahjong table the emperor was playing would also be on the eve of a draw. On the 15th day of the first month, there was no snow or wind in Jingdou. After nightfall, colorful lanterns hung high throughout the city. People weaved through the dry streets. Men and women used the reflection of the beautiful lights to search for the faces that moved their hearts, and avoid the harassment that annoyed them. The young ladies brought their serving girls around with blushing faces as they played. The polite young men maintained a distance that was neither too far nor too close, and quietly watched them play. That night spring arrived early. Who knew how many shoes had fallen off on the street, And who knew how many tender skin had been touched by those hands? Tailing and investigating, eye movements and probing continued happily in the night. The people controlled by hormones collectively sank into a matchmaking activity, without a matchmaker. For the Qing court, the joy of the people could not affect its sternness. Although large palace lanterns were hung in the corner of the royal palace, and some riddles had been prepared inside the palace for the Empress Dowager, Empress, and other nobles to enjoy, even the square, black, and gray building of the Overwatch Council had red lanterns hung under Fan Xian's orders. But it was still sternness. The movement of the military had begun long before the 15th. The governor of the north had led his personal soldiers back north. He was going to Cangzhou and Yanjing to block the sharp gaze of northern Qi's famous general. Yizhong had also returned to Dingzhou. The court once again increased the number of soldiers to the west. Taking elite soldiers from the remaining 5 roads of Central Army, they replenished the Dingzhou area and formed an invincible army of 100,000 people. When spring arrived, these 100,000 soldiers would push another 200 li to the west. It was called pressure. If there was any strange movement between Shi Hu and the northern man who had marched thousands of li south, these invincible soldiers of the Qing kingdom would find an opportunity to launch a surprise attack and tear large swaths of the Hu people's flesh and blood. The military was an important matter. Although it was only a movement, and the battle had yet to start, the 6 ministries had long become busy in order to deal with logistics. Fortunately, the Qing kingdom thrived on the military. All matters had long been set in stone. The cooperation between the various ministries appeared orderly and efficient. When facing outsiders, the Qing kingdom was always this united. At this moment, no one remembered the strife between the princes and Fan Xian's terror. Fan Xian had also been busy for a number of days. Because the Overwatch Council was responsible for providing intelligence to the military, it was also responsible for examining the equipment and weapons sent up by the various departments. All sorts of matters piled up at once. Fortunately, he had Yan Bingyun's help. Only on the night of the 15th could Fan Xian enter the palace and take a look at the legendary martial conference. The battles in the palace were indeed exciting. There were indeed a number of aces in the Qing kingdom. However, without Yan Xiaoyi and Fan Xian's battle to the death, the officials did not seem to have much interest. No one was stupid enough to take the initiative to challenge Fan Xian to a battle. They were not Yan Xiaoyi. They did not want to die. On the 22nd of the first month, the nerves in the court and palace that had become tense because of the strange movements on the border had gradually grown used to it and gradually relaxed. They had to live as they should. When it was time to eat, they still had to eat. When it was time to dress, they still had to dress. They couldn't let the nobles in the palace not have a few new clothes for the new year. Thus, the embroidery bureau in the palace sent out a team to a certain shop to take over the embroidered cloth that had been shipped from the west. Because the empress in the eastern palace did not like the embroidery colors that had been sent up from Jiangnan last year, she had requested an edict ahead of time to order another batch. Extra errands like this that did not go through the palace treasury or the palace were often good opportunities for the main eunuchs to make a lot of money. Just the commissions and gifts alone were probably worth 30% of the price of the embroidered cloth. With one trip out of the palace, they could easily take a few thousand liang of silver notes into their sleeves. In the past, because the second prince was favored, this errand had always been handled by eunuch Dai in Lady Shu's palace. However, this year, it was clear that the second prince was not as favored as in previous years. Eunuch Dai, because of his corruption and involvement in the Hanging Temple assassination case, had lost most of his power. Thus, the major eunuchs in the palace were all envious. They all began to move, wanting to take over old Dai's position. However, after asking around for some news, the major eunuchs, including Eunuch Yao and Eunuch Ho, all stopped their activities. They had heard that this year, the head eunuch in the Eastern Palace, Hongzhu, was in charge. Hongzhu's surname was Hong, and he was deeply trusted by the empress. Additionally, the emperor seemed to like this nimble little eunuch very much. Thus, his position in the palace grew day by day, Even someone like Eunuch Yao did not want to stand in the way of Hongzhu's gradual rise to glory, so he chose to give way. In the morning, the palace guards stood guard outside a large shop. They yawned endlessly because they believed that no one would come looking for trouble. There were no nobles in the shop, only a eunuch. Every time they thought of how these strong soldiers could not follow the Dingzhou army on a western expedition and had to protect a mere eunuch, these guards were not in a good mood. Naturally, they relaxed a great deal. In a quiet room on the second floor, Hongzhu was carefully examining the number of threads and color of the embroidered cloth. Although it was a good opportunity to earn commissions, he had to be careful when working for the empress. As for the shopkeeper of this dongi shop, he had long been chased out by him. Hongzhu's fingertips trembled slightly. It was clear that he was uneasy. He didn't know when or how Sir Fan Jr. would be able to hide it from the guard's eyes and ears to meet with him. Just as he was feeling extremely uncomfortable, the light in the room suddenly bent slightly. A slight change occurred in the light and shadow. Who is it? Hongzhu turned around cautiously, but did not call out this question. Fan Xian, who was wearing commoner clothing, rubbed the corners of his brows that had been glued painfully after his disguise. He made a hand gesture toward Hongzhu, and then took out a piece of jade from his clothes and handed it over. This piece of jade was the one he had thought of many ways to get from the Luochuan gang a few days ago. Hongzhu accepted the jade with some confusion and glanced at it. He felt that this piece of jade looked very unfamiliar, but it seemed to be something used in the palace. Furthermore, the style and lines of the jade gave him a familiar feeling. This is something from the Eastern Palace, Fan Xian said quietly. Hongzhu pressed his lips together and said, "What do I need to do?" Fan Xian set a date and furrowed his brows. "Every time the crown prince goes to Guangxin Palace, it should be this day. You have a lot of information in the palace. See if it's accurate." Hongzhu thought back and calculated a bit. He then nodded his head. Fan Xian relaxed. This date was the conclusion Wang Qinian had come to after spending every day watching the imperial relative's manor. The imperial relative's manor was responsible for sending medicine to the palace, so the date was basically stable. Fan Xian stared into Hongzhu's eyes and said, "After the embroidered cloth enters the palace, according to usual practice, the Eastern Palace will distribute it to the various palaces. You should know what time it is if the empress has a serving girl send the embroidered cloth to Guangxin Palace. Usually, it's the afternoon of the second day." Hongzhu was a bit nervous. He didn't know what this matter had to do with the embroidered cloth. "Very good. You're responsible for buying it. Then, delay the time for this batch of embroidered cloth to enter the palace," Fan Xian said. "Calculate the time well. Make sure that when the Eastern Palace sends the embroidered cloth into Guangxin Palace, the crown prince will also be there." Hongzhu picked at the itchy pimple on his face and asked with confusion, "What use does this have?" Fan Xian didn't reply. Hongzhu looked thoughtfully at the jade amulet in his hand and suddenly said with astonishment, "This seems to have been used by the empress before." "Correct," Fan Xian ordered seriously. "It was secretly sold out of the palace by your eunuchs. These little bastards are quite daring." Hongzhu had completely forgotten the current situation and unconsciously returned to his role as the head eunuch of the Eastern Palace. He spoke viciously. He was a major eunuch and had plenty of places to make money. He didn't need to use such petty tricks. Then he suddenly came to his senses. He knew that Sir Fan Jr. would not simply have him straighten out the order in the Eastern Palace. He looked at Fan Xian's not quite there face and asked in a trembling voice, "This piece of jade, how do we deal with it?" "Put it in the room of the serving girl, who sends the embroidered cloth into Guangxin Palace." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then sighed. "What we need to do next is very simple. Make the empress remember this piece of jade. What will happen then?" Hongzhu was a clever man and immediately understood. However, he still did not connect this entire matter to Guangxin Palace. However, Fan Xian didn't have much time to explain. He heard the footsteps coming from downstairs and moved closer to Hongzhu's ear to give him a few reminders. He told him not to worry about anything and only needed to do these 3 things properly. He didn't need to make any unnecessary movements, pay attention to his own safety, and don't get dragged into it. The sound of knocking came from outside. Fan Xian's body flashed and disappeared from the room. The owner of the shop entered respectfully and asked if this eunuch had any other orders. Hong Zhu looked at the empty space beside him and suddenly became absent-minded. A moment later he thought of Fan Xian's orders. He furrowed his brows and squeezed out a sharp voice. This cloth seems to be different from the one the Empress asked for. The owner paused and complained bitterly in his heart. Eunuch, what are you saying? I am just a small businessman. How could I lie to the nobles in the palace? As he spoke, a few banknotes were shoved into Hong Zhu's sleeves. Hong Zhu's gaze flickered and was satisfied with the amount. However, he still couldn't let go. He furrowed his brows and said, Is there a problem with the yellow dandelion in this pattern? It looks a bit off, particularly the thread used in these satin. Why do I feel it isn't thick enough? How could it be? The owner cursed in his heart and said with a pained expression, This is authentic Western cloth, 3 layers of blended fabric, 36 stitches. There is nothing better. Hong Zhu chuckled and said, Is that so? But there is no rush. Go back and check it carefully. I'll come back to take it in a few days. The owner panicked and said, Eunuch, this is something the Empress in the palace urgently wants. If it's too late, not only me but even you. These words made Hong Zhu unhappy. He glared and darkly said, Listen carefully. When the palace wants this cloth, it will depend on when I am happy. What kind of identity does the Empress have? How could she remember such a small matter? After saying this, Hong Zhu brushed his sleeves and went downstairs. His expression was very unfriendly. The owner of the shop followed behind. He only knew that he had offended this eunuch and cried out bitterly in his heart. He wondered how many banknotes he would have to shove into this eunuch's body if this dragged on for a few days. He had no idea that Hong Zhu's expression was unfriendly because he was afraid and excited. Chapter 487. Last night, my son actually jumped to the second place. I really can't stand it. I sincerely thank everyone for your votes. Although I don't know how many days I'll be happy, I'll at least be glorious. My face is shining. I forgot to wish everyone a happy holiday yesterday. I'll make it up to you all today. Also, I've put Dun Huai's comments on the public page. Everyone can take a look. I really like his words. After returning to the capital for a month, Fan Xian smelled something very clearly and understood some things. The most important was, of course, the words the second prince had once said to him in private. He had to admit that second brother's analysis and judgment were very accurate. If the situation continued to develop like this, his situation would become extremely awkward and unclear. Although the Qing kingdom's silent and deeply popular emperor had coldly and mercilessly provoked his sons to fight each other in the past few years, the Qing kingdom's emperor, who was silent and deeply popular among the people, had been very coldly provoking his sons to fight each other. But this kind of fighting had to be controlled to a certain extent. Although he was cold and valiant, he was not a pervert. As long as he was not a pervert, he would not watch his sons kill each other. The second prince of the past, and the current Fan Xian, were actually just whetstones the emperor used to sharpen the crown prince. If the crown prince, this newly forged sword, broke on these 2 whetstones, presumably the emperor would not hesitate to replace him. The competition between A and B had always been this intense. The crown prince's current performance was not bad. Although he didn't have many opportunities to display his brilliance and heat, and his blade was sealed in its sheath, never to see the light of day, this crown prince was clearly not a weakling. It was just that the opportunities to shine in the past had all been snatched away by his brothers. If the sword was kept in its sheath, the emperor would be at ease because the crown prince's choice was smart enough and had the wisdom of forbearance. The emperor had been watching all of this coldly the entire time. He wanted to clearly see his sons' hearts, so he had always given the crown prince many chances and enough time. If the crown prince continued to wait calmly like this, the emperor might not make any major changes. For Fan Xian, not changing was something he could not accept. Many years later, once the crown prince took the throne, and the empress became the empress dowager, what would Fan Xian do? Just as the second disciple said, the one who should be anxious right now should be Fan Xian. However, the emperor would not allow Fan Xian to do anything too out of line. Although Fan Xian still didn't understand why the emperor would remain silent, he suddenly thought of something. He didn't remember if it was something Chen Pingping, his father, or his father-in-law had once said, but it was something very important. The emperor was suspicious and sensitive, but the emperor wanted too much. He wanted to unify the world. He wanted to obtain the most glorious name in history. However, if he wanted to continue to be glorious, the Qing emperor had to care about history's evaluation of him. If he changed the crown prince, this matter would be recorded in the history books as a test of his virtue and ability. If his sons killed each other, it would leave a thick and heavy mark. Fan Xian put down the teacup in his hand and sucked in a cold breath. He finally understood the reason for the emperor's silence. The emperor still hoped that the matter of the fight for the throne could be resolved peacefully, and that the Qing kingdom could be passed on in a gentle manner. As emperors, there were only two things they desired. One was territory, and the other was eternal fame. The emperor refused to give up on either of them. A glimmer of a cold smile flashed through the corners of Fan Xian's eyes. He said to himself, throwing his sons into the jungle to be educated, and then in the end, he wants to twist his sons, who have already become bloodthirsty beasts, back onto the path of humanity. This emperor's thinking is a bit too beautiful. The struggle for imperial power gradually eased under the emperor's powerful suppression and secret declaration. Fan Xian would not allow the situation to continue like this. He had to force the emperor to make up his mind earlier. When he was in Jiangnan, Fan Xian had already guessed that the old man in Chen Garden had the same thoughts as him. He was also using all kinds of methods to influence the emperor's thoughts, trying to make the emperor make up his mind earlier. However, what he didn't know was that Chen Pingping had skillfully woven a large net, including the true cause of Great Master Sanshi's death, and the relationship between the Juanshan Conference and the eldest princess. All these heavy bombs had not been able to make the emperor truly make up his mind to resolve these matters. Thus, Chen Pingping had chosen the most ruthless move. This move had been used by Fan Xian without Chen Pingping's knowledge. An old man and a young man worked hard together for the same goal. They planned quietly and wanted to play with the Qing emperor's emotions and use the emperor's paranoia and jealousy hidden in the depths of his heart to achieve the goal they wanted. In this world, there were not many people like Chen Pingping and Fan Xian who understood the Qing emperor's heart. There were even fewer people who dared to plot and provoke the Qing emperor's emotions. When it came down to it, it only showed that the leaders of the Overwatch Council were all ruthless and shameless people who did not care about their lives. However, Chen Pingping's goal was far from just having the crown prince step down. On this point, he thought further than Fan Xian, and his intentions were wilder. The first month was about to end. Fan Xian's trip back to the capital was also about to end. His subordinates were all preparing for their return to Jiangnan. He made the best use of the remaining time to keep his father and Chen Pingping company for a few days. These two elders were getting on in years. He was often in Jiangnan and was unable to fulfill his filial duties. He truly felt apologetic. De Bao had gone from Danzhou to Hangzhou and then to Wuzhou. After spending a new year with Prime Minister Lin, he had also returned to Jingdou. Fan Xian had to accompany his brother-in-law for a good stroll through Jingdou. Big Dumb and Little Dumb were having a good time. However, time was tight, so it was hard to avoid a sense of panic. Amidst this meticulously arranged and tight schedule, Fan Xizha followed the second group Deng Ziyu had left behind, and once again headed north. The Chamber of Commerce traveling in the north needed this talented youth to manage. It was never good to leave Shangjing for too long. Ever since Fan Xian had confirmed that matter, his feelings toward the north had sunk into some kind of dilemma. Although he was more confident about his brother and sister's safety in the north, he unconsciously wanted to avoid something. Thus, he did not have Xizha bring a secret letter to the northern Qi emperor. The other people in the Qinian unit also began to busy themselves. Hong Chongqing took Fan Xian's order and went to Jiangnan ahead of time. This was a very important matter. Fan Xian told him to inform Su Wenmao to get ready. Before the matter in the palace exploded and the news reached Jiangnan, they had to create a perfect time difference to swallow the entire Ming family. Mu Tai and Mu Feng, of the First Bureau, were also busy with official matters in Jingdou, and could not follow by Fan Xian's side at all times. Sir Yin Jr. was busy in the Overwatch Council coordinating daily affairs, and avoiding the marriage introductions of the noble ladies in Jingdou. He was miserable beyond words. For a moment, Fan Xian's only capable confidant was Wang Qinian, the old man. Fan Xian was eating with De Bao in Wang Qinian's garden, when he suddenly thought of the pitiful Yin Bingyan, and the words the great Wang Fei had quietly said to him that day in Prince Heching's manor. He couldn't help but shake his head. If Yin Bingyan truly wanted to marry the young lady of the Shen family, it would truly be a difficult matter. First, this matter needed the emperor's approval in the palace. Secondly, the young lady of the Shen family needed a suitable identity. The great Wang Fei was a good friend of the young lady of the Shen family when they were in Shangjing, so she handed this troublesome matter to Fan Xian to handle. In his life, Fan Xian was only good at breaking up marriages. He was not good at being a matchmaker. With a sorrowful sigh, he picked at the food on his plate. Wang Qinian was squatting at the side smoking a cigarette. Seeing that Fan Xian's expression was not very good, he coughed and asked, "The taste is not to your liking?" De Bao sat by Fan Xian's side and chewed endlessly in his mouth. "Delicious." Fan Xian used the tip of his chopsticks to point at the plate and said, "Stewed fish slices made like this can rival the chefs in the brothel. Of course the taste is excellent." The brothel he was referring to was Baoyue brothel. Having received Fan Xian's praise, Wang Qinian smiled. The wrinkles on his face deepened. As they spoke, a 12 or 13-year-old girl carried a plate out from the inner room and obediently placed it on the table. She was too shy to bow and ran back with small quick steps. Fan Xian looked at the girl's back and sighed. "Lao Wang, you look like an old elm tree. How did you give birth to such a lively girl?" That girl was Wang Qinian's daughter. She was also the person Fan Xian had once threatened Wang Qinian in his letters. Wang Qinian's heart jumped. He smiled bitterly and said, still young, still young. I can't see if she will be beautiful in the future." Fan Xian laughed loudly and said, "What are you afraid of? Who would dare to forcefully take your daughter?" These words were true. Although Wang Qinian had insisted on not taking the position of head of the 8 bureaus, most people in Jingdou knew that he was Fan Xian's closest confidant. With this layer of relationship present, regardless of whether it was the 6 ministries, 3 departments, or 3 departments, no one dared to underestimate him or offend him. De Bao suddenly beamed with joy. "This girl is beautiful." It was now Fan Xian's turn to be shocked. He wondered to himself what would happen if his brother-in-law suddenly fell in love and insisted on marrying Lao Wang's daughter. Of course he wouldn't agree, but how could he appease this person's emotions? Fortunately, De Bao's temperament was still that of a 6 or 7-year-old child, so it was impossible for him to think of such things. He just stared blankly with his chopsticks in his hand, and the oil and water in his mouth slid down, but he didn't even notice. No one knew what he was thinking. Fan Xian picked up the wet towel beside him and helped De Bao wipe away the grease at the side of his lips. He asked curiously, "What are you thinking about?" De Bao tilted his head slightly. The smile on his face gradually froze, revealing a trace of grievance and sadness that was rarely seen on his face. He stammered, "Air Bao likes the beautiful Gu Liang." Fan Xian's heart darkened, and the hand holding the towel froze. He didn't know what to comfort. Wang Qinian, who was listening at the side, was a little curious. He knocked his pipe on the stone grinder beside his feet and asked, "Young uncle, who is Air Bao?" "Second Bao is my younger brother. He's very smart." A proud smile bloomed on De Bao's face, but this smile immediately turned into the sadness of a child. "But he's dead." Wang Qinian and Fan Xian stood in the corner of the courtyard, each pulling out their tobacco pipes. Green smoke curled up and the stench of leaves was suffocating. Wang Qinian turned his head to glance at Lin De Bao, who was playing with his little girl. Lowering his voice, he asked, So second Bao is young Master Lin Gong. Lin Gong was killed by the people of Dongyi 2 years ago. But I heard that the manor has been hiding it from young Master De Bao. How did he know? Fan Xian spat out a mouthful of bitter saliva. After a moment of silence, he said, I told him. Although he's stupid, I've always treated him like a normal person. He and the Lin brothers were very close. I didn't feel comfortable hiding this matter from him. There won't be any problems, will there? Wang Qinian asked carefully. What problems could there be? I told him 2 years ago. Fan Xian pressed his dry lips together and faintly said. De Bao's intelligence is not fully developed. He is like a child who can't grow up. But it doesn't mean he doesn't know anything. There is a husband-gazing rock over at Nanjiao. I don't want another brother Bao at my side. After saying this, he glanced at De Bao and found that he was crouching by the Wang family's girl, digging earthworms. His gaze softened, and there was a tinge of pity and apologetic look in his eyes. Suddenly, someone knocked on the wooden door of the Wang family courtyard. The person knocked very hard and hurriedly. No one knew what had happened. Fan Xian and Wang Qinian met each other's eyes and furrowed their brows. Wang Qinian had just stepped forward to open the door when a man rushed in. Rushing in front of Fan Xian, he said in a loud voice, Congratulations, sir. Fan Xian jumped in fright at this person. Focusing his eyes, he saw it was Teng Zijing. He couldn't help but curse. What's the matter? Didn't I tell you to go back to the country estate to read books in preparation for the martial exams in the spring? Why did you run back to the capital? He had wholeheartedly wanted Teng Zijing to be able to embark on an official career. It could be said that he had not let down Teng Zijing's attentive service and crippled leg after he had picked him up from Danzhou. However, Teng Zijing's personality was very similar to Wang Qinian's. Although he loved officialdom, he loved the life at Fan Xian's side even more. Additionally, he couldn't get into those military books. Thus, after reading for 3 days in the country estate, he had run back. Teng Zijing's expression was full of shame, but he immediately thought of the important matter. Very happily he said, Young master, quickly go back to the manor. The old master is already back. The whole family is waiting for you. What exactly happened? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He went over to hold De Bao's hand and prepared to leave for the carriage. Teng Zijing followed behind him and said with a smile, Mistress Lu is pregnant. Fan Xian paused and stood where he was. Turning around, he rubbed his head and said, What? Am I going to have another brother? Father is indeed extraordinary. Teng Zijing paused and only understood what he meant a moment later. He hurriedly explained, It's not madam, Mistress Lu is pregnant. Fan Xian still didn't understand what he meant. Sitting in the carriage, he tied up De Bao's clothes. Turning his head, he said angrily, Speak clearly. Even if the Duke's manor has a child, there is no need to be so nervous. Teng Zijing couldn't resist laughing and said, It's not the Duke's manor, it's our own manor. Cici is pregnant. Fan Xian paused. Only now did he understand. Although he had long taken Cici into the manor, in the depths of his heart, he still saw her as a younger sister. He truly did not have any precise thoughts of her as a concubine. Coincidentally, Cici had been raised by the old Danzhou manor since she was young. She never had a surname. Later, when she entered the capital, Cija's mother, Lady Lu, took good care of Cici because of similar circumstances. In the end, she simply had Cici take the surname Lu. Mistress Lu, so he was talking about Cici. No wonder Fan Xian couldn't react in time. Cici is pregnant. Fan Xian chuckled. Then I have to hurry back to the manor to see. Women who are pregnant for the first time always have bad tempers, particularly a shrewish girl like her. If I'm late, I'm afraid I'll end up with a lot of complaints. The carriage trotted along the street out of the west side of the city and headed toward the south side of the city, where the Fan Manor was. Suddenly, a muffled sound came from the carriage. It was as if someone had jumped up and stupidly had his head come into intimate contact with the hard carriage. A terrifyingly loud voice came from the carriage. The voice was filled with shock and terror. Half the pedestrians on the street could hear it clearly. Cici is pregnant. I'm going to be a father. Fan Xian, who had been reborn into the world of the Qing kingdom, and whose mental age should be in his 30s, was finally going to be a father. The passing on of living things was always the second most powerful need one could instinctively control. Logically speaking, Fan Xian, who was sufficiently mature, should have shown a kind of controllable and sincere joy when faced with such a joyous event. However, there was clearly something wrong with his performance. He was very excited, uncontrollably excited. At the same time, other than joy, he was very afraid. Sitting by Cece's bed, Fan Xian looked like an idiot at the girl who was 2 years older than him. Cece's face was slightly pale. It looked like she was beginning to feel nervous, after knowing that a life had suddenly appeared in her belly. Fan Xian looked at her dumbly and said, "How did you get pregnant?" Wanner sat at the head of the bed and fed Cece something. Her face was filled with joy. She had always wanted to give Fan Xian a child, but she had never succeeded. Now that Cece was pregnant, thinking that Fan Xian would have descendants, she, as a housewife, also became happy. If this was a normal family, perhaps a wife without descendants would feel some jealousy toward a concubine. However, the difference in status between her and Cece's was too great. It was unavoidably foolish to feel jealousy like this. She listened to Fan Xian's strange question, and couldn't help but furrow her brows slightly. Scolding, she said, "What are you saying?" Chapter 488. Wanner took the bowl and left the room. Fan Xian looked at Cece lying at the head of the bed and warmly said, "Rest well." Usually, Cece slept in the outer room of the master's bedroom in the back of the manor. However, the doctor had suddenly seen that she was pregnant. Lady Lu had made the decision to clear out a few comfortable rooms for her to move in. Fan Xian turned his head to look at the furnishings in the room, and felt secretly grateful to Lady Lu. He then looked at Cece's slightly pale and sallow face, and felt slightly apologetic. In a quiet voice he said, "It was my fault to be the last person to know." As the head of the family, Fan Xian should show a warm side and a happy side. He should say some nice things to calm the pregnant woman. However, he had only said a few words before he choked. He looked stupidly at Cece's face, and couldn't speak for a moment. After a moment of silence, Cece's eyes reddened slightly. She bit her lip and said, "Young master, I can see that you're not happy." "How so?" Fan Xian jumped in fright and forced a smile. It was too sudden. I wasn't mentally prepared at all. He held the girl's hand and slowly squeezed it. Smiling slightly, he said, "In my heart, you are still that girl who has always stood by my side grinding ink and adding incense. I always feel that it hasn't been long since we left Danzhou. Yet you are about to become the mother of a child. We've already left Danzhou for 3 years, my muddle-headed young master." Cece's tears turned into a smile. She half leaned on the bed and gazed at him with a gentle gaze. Regardless of whether it was when they lived together in Jiangnan, or after formally entering the family in Danzhou, she still habitually called Fan Xian young master, and had not changed it. "Even if I become an old man, I'm still not mentally prepared." Fan Xian patted her hand tenderly. "Being a father is indeed a bit scary. Young master knows everything. Besides, giving birth is a woman's business." "Knows everything. Giving birth is a woman's business. But teaching a child is a man's business. Raising a child into an adult is much more difficult than writing poetry and killing people." Fan Xian laughed at himself. He reached his hand into the blankets, and carefully stroked Cece's slightly bulging belly. He couldn't help but blame himself. "Earlier, father said it's already been 4 months. Why didn't you tell me? Even if you were shy, you should have told the mistress." Cece felt the palm moving on her abdomen, and her cheeks reddened. She pulled the blanket up to her neck and said with slight fear, I'm afraid it's fake. How can it be real or fake when I'm pregnant?" Fan Xian closed his eyes, and felt the rise and fall under his palm. A complicated emotion rose in his heart. There was joy, fear, and a slight sourness. Was that his child in her belly? He really couldn't accept the fact that he was going to be a father for a while. That kind of fear actually overwhelmed the joy. Fortunately, his mind was clear at this time. and he could still show it in front of Cece. Otherwise Cece, who was a new mother, would definitely hate him. Fan Xian scratched his head with a slight headache. What should I do now? Cece couldn't resist laughing out loud. Young master, of course, you should eat and sleep when you should. I can't have you watch over me every day, just because I'm pregnant. Fan Xian suddenly stretched out his hand and gently pulled Cece's wrist over. Placing his finger on it, he closed his eyes and tilted his head to listen closely to the pulse. Wonder happened to walk in. Seeing her husband taking Cece's pulse, she opened her large eyes and asked curiously, "Is it a man or a woman?" Fan Xian slowly moved his finger away and said with a smile, "How could it be so easy to tell? Do you think my finger is an ultrasound?" Must? Wonder and Cece heard this new word and furrowed their brows at the same time, unable to understand. Fan Xian coughed and reminded Cece of the things she had to pay attention to, particularly not to catch a cold. He then walked to the door and called for the wife of the Tung family. He gave some detailed instructions. Of course, he had to find healthy servants and women. As for the food, he didn't just blindly eat large amounts of fish and meat. He only picked out a few nutritious dishes. Is there goat milk in the manor? The wife of the Tung family nodded excitedly. Cece was pregnant with the first grandchild of the Fan family, so the servants couldn't help but be excited. Receiving a positive answer, Fan Xian said, "1 bowl a day. It has to be boiled." Inside the room, Cece nestled against Wonner's side and said unhappily, "I don't like to drink goat milk." Lin Wonner thought about it. When she was being treated for her lung disease, she had also been forced to drink goat milk by Fan Xian every day. The smell was truly unbearable. She couldn't resist smiling toward the door and saying, "Is this goat milk an immortal pill?" Fan Xian turned his head and smiled. "Although it is not an immortal pill, it is indeed good stuff. However, the smell is a bit strong. Cece, you have to endure it and keep drinking it." Lin Wonner suddenly thought of the method Siki had thought of at the time and happily said, "Let Siki do this. I don't know if she put almonds or jasmine tea in it. There's a faint astringent taste, but it takes away all the smell." Hearing that Siki was going to serve her food and drink, Cece, who was lying on the bed, felt uneasy. She was originally a serving girl with the same status as Siki. Now that she was pregnant, her treatment had suddenly increased so much. She truly didn't dare to accept it. She was afraid that everyone in the manor would gossip about her, so she unconsciously wanted to open her mouth to refuse. Fan Xian waved his hand and said, "There isn't that much empty courtesy in the back manor. When you were a serving girl, I still had to massage your back. I'll let Siki work a bit harder. I just don't know if this method will work." Cece's face reddened. She found that with a flash outside the door, Siki's proud face had appeared. The girl smiled and said, "Of course this method will work. At that time, I was the one who made the ladies goat milk every day. You just had to use gauze to filter out the tea dregs." Wonner smiled and glared at her. "Look at how proud you are." Cece insisted on calling Fan Xian young master, and Siki insisted on calling him Lady Wonner. In this house, there was a master and mistress, as well as 2 serving girls. The way they addressed each other was strange. Perhaps only a man like Fan Xian, who had the experience of his previous life, would not care about the so-called status. Fortunately, these 3 girls could all cooperate with his footsteps. This was a good thing. Usually, you have to bask in the sun more. Don't believe the nonsense of those midwives. If you don't get some air, you'll suffocate to death in the room. Fan Xian suddenly thought of something and spoke very seriously to the Tung family's wife, and Wonner. He knew that if Lady Lu suddenly became old, only these 2 people would be able to speak up for Cece. "Papa." The Tung family's wife quickly spat and said, "Today is a joyous occasion. How can you say that word?" Fan Xian couldn't be bothered with her and said to himself, "Vegetables and fruits have to be guaranteed. This cannot be missing." He turned his head and said to Cece, "When you can't eat, you still have to eat some snacks. Have the girls go make them." All right. The Tung family's wife was thick-skinned. Minding her own business, she covered Fan Xian's mouth and said, "In the end, you are the first. In the future, you will have hundreds of children and thousands of grandchildren. If the young master is always so nervous and long-winded, he will torment us servants to death. Fan Xian comforted Cici with a few more words and told her a few jokes to relax her nervous state of mind. He then took Wan'er's little hand and left the room. The two of them wandered around the back garden. Along the way, they saw a few capable servants of the manor rushing over. When they saw them, they quickly bowed respectfully. However, a glimmer of awkwardness occasionally appeared in their expressions. What are they going to do? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and asked. Wan'er smiled and said, They are all going to congratulate Cici. Seeing me, of course, they will feel awkward. Awkward about what? Fan Xian was not stupid to this extent. He was just worried that Wan'er truly had a knot in her heart, so he purposely asked. Wan'er glared at him and leaned her head on his shoulder. In a quiet voice she said, What do you think? Fan Xian patted her chubby cheek and asked with a slight smile. Then are you really happy or just pretending to be happy? Wan'er's childish face still had the calmness of a housewife. She still said the same 3 words. What do you think? Am I really that nervous? Fan Xian held Wan'er's hand and walked to a stone bench by the side of a fake mountain to sit down. He held Wan'er on his lap. It was quiet here. There were no servants passing by. Wan'er was slightly embarrassed, so she let him be. You're not careful enough to freeze yourself, Wan'er grumbled. Wan'er grumbled. She suddenly remembered what he had asked her. After thinking for a while, she raised her head and looked at him with her watery eyes. After a while, she said seriously, That is what I wanted to ask you. Why do you look so unhappy? And, you seem nervous and afraid. What are you worried about? Are you really worried about my feelings? You should know that I am not that kind of person. Fan Xian shook his head and smiled as he tightened his arms around her. After thinking for a moment he said, I also don't know. Perhaps I really am not mentally prepared to be a father. What do I need to prepare? Wan'er had long gotten used to her husband's habits of thinking that were not very similar to the men of this world. For example, can I create a good environment for the next generation to grow up in? Wan'er smiled slightly and said, Let's not think too far ahead right now. What I am more curious about is whether the child in Cici's stomach is a boy or a girl. Didn't we say earlier? Yes, you don't have a certain chance of success. The use of a certain chance of success is very clever. Then, do you like a boy or a girl? A girl, Fan Xian said decisively. Lin Wan'er looked at him with some confusion. A moment later, she seemed to understand something. She sighed and said, No wonder you weren't so happy after knowing you had a child presumably. You feel that Cici is no longer a girl. Fan Xian was confused and asked in a daze, Why do you think so? Girls are pearls. Once they have children, they will gradually grow old and become the eyeballs of a fish. You'll like pearls. Even if you don't play with them, you can look at them. Lin Wan'er smiled merrily. This is something you once wrote yourself. Don't deny it. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. This was Grandmaster Chao's view, although it was similar to his own. This was not the true reason why he was still unable to feel joy when he learned he would have children. Even if I have to become the eyeballs of a fish, I still want to have children for you. Lin Wan'er stared at him in a daze and gently bit her lower lip. She spoke gently but forcefully. Fan Xian smiled and nodded. Suddenly his expression became serious. I know there are some rather strange rules in this world. For example, children born to concubines have to call the main wife their mother. There are even those who were raised by the main wife and rarely get to see their own mother. Lin Wan'er looked at him and furrowed her brows slightly. She vaguely guessed what he was going to say. Although all the large families in the world are like this. Fan Xian looked at her seriously. We don't want to be like this. It was not a request or a demand. It was a notice that could not be refused. It was no. Fan Xian originally didn't want to say such serious words at a time like this, and disturb Wan'er's already difficult to suppress sour feelings. In his previous life, when he was watching the door of a large manor, he had been frightened badly by Sister Gao Hua's role as the bastard of a middle-aged fish. Lin Wan'er nodded. A glimmer of sadness flashed through her eyes. Slowly she said, I understand what you mean. Don't be sad. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then smiled and said, You've seen all the improvements I've made to the medicine during this half a year in Hangzhou. Most importantly, tomorrow Sir Fei is coming. Since he dares to come see us, naturally, he has something good to give us. The delicate body in his arms suddenly shook. Lin Wanner looked at his eyes in disbelief and said with pleasant surprise, "It's true." Although this news made Wanner happy, Fan Xian knew that his merciless words had still hurt her heart. However, for the sake of Cici and the child in her womb, he had to say it first. He sighed gently. First, there was indeed something stifling in his heart that needed to be released. Second, in his previous life, Sir Jean had once used this trick on Xiaobao in The Deer and the Cauldron. It had never failed against girls. As expected, Wanner saw his serious expression and immediately pushed aside the small hidden bitterness in her heart. She asked with concern, "What is it?" "Earlier, you also saw that after learning of Cici's pregnancy, I wasn't very happy. On the contrary, I was a bit scared." Fan Xian lowered his head, as if he wanted to find support and comfort in his heart from his wife's breathing. Actually, there are a few reasons. The first reason was that he was worried that Wanner would be sad from touching this scene. This reason had been lightly mentioned earlier. As for the second reason, it was actually very simple. "I am a person without a father," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "Although I have a father, or even two fathers, when I was in Danzhou, I didn't have either. Furthermore, the real one seems to have never been my father." It was a difficult sentence to pronounce, but Wanner understood it. She glanced around cautiously to make sure that no one else would hear these words. "Father treats me very well, but you understand, in the end, this is not the same thing. As for the one in the palace, ever since Danzhou came to Jingdo, I've seen through him. Even your crown prince and second prince are driven around like donkeys, much less an illegitimate child like me." "I am a person without a father," Fan Xian repeated with emphasis. "That is why I am very afraid that I won't be a father. That is why my first reaction earlier was fear and unease. In his previous life, Fan Xian didn't have parents. In this life, he also didn't have parents. Even worse, in his previous life, it was the heavens that were terrible. In this life, it was his parents that were terrible. In the depths of his heart, he had always thought that when it came to educating his children, his mother did a terrible job. It made him very sad. In both of his lives, he had been lacking in this area. It had cast a great shadow on his heart. Perhaps he hadn't noticed it in the past, but now, the good news from the Fan Manor completely revealed his dark side. He unconsciously refused to admit that he wanted to be a father. Lin Wanner looked at him with a face full of pity. "My mother also doesn't love me," Fan Xian said woodenly. "Perhaps you don't believe it, but she really doesn't love me." Unable to love or not love, the world always thought that Yi Qingmei was Fan Xian's mother. But only he knew that after being reborn into this world, he only had curiosity and an indescribable feeling for that distant woman. But as he gradually grew up, the people around him constantly talked about that once dazzling woman, and the things around him constantly talked about that woman's past. The marks around him constantly reminded Fan Xian of that woman's existence. Over time, Fan Xian, who had never received a mother's love in his previous life, finally got used to this. He began to gradually accept that his mother was Yi Qingmei, and he began to feel attached to that name. Perhaps because of the strongest bond between mother and son, the two lonely souls of the transmigrator were connected. He admitted this, and in that cave in the western mountains of northern Qi, in front of Shao'an, he personally said these words. But after reading the letter in the box, Fan Xian, who knew many of the stories of the past, had to tell himself that Yi Qingmei did not love him. It was not referring to this soul from another world, but rather she did not have much love for this son of flesh. He had inherited Yi Qingmei's Qingyu Hall of the Overwatch Council's palace treasury, the connections of the past and close comrades, but she did not purposely leave these things to him. And even if she did leave them to him, so what? "My mother doesn't love me," Fan Xian said calmly. "Otherwise she wouldn't have abandoned me and left on her own." Lin Wanner wanted to comfort the somewhat absent-minded Fan Xian, but she didn't know where to start. She, who had grown up in the palace, knew very well what a dazzling figure her mother-in-law was. It's not just because of this. Fan Xian furrowed his brows as he thought. When the box was opened, he was a bit disappointed because the letter was left for Uncle Wu Zhu, and not for him. The contents of the letter in particular made him even more disappointed. She called me a bastard son, he said with a smile. And she didn't leave me a single word, she just left. This kind of indifference, this kind of calmness, appears to be so calm as to be absurd. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and thought of his romantic past. He always felt that perhaps his birth had always been an absurd matter. He continued to speak, but Wanner felt a chill in her heart as she listened. She didn't tell me how to survive in such a dangerous world. She didn't tell me who was worthy of trust. She didn't tell me how I should eat my food, or how I should love my wife. Fan Xian smiled. She had great love for the people of the world, yet she didn't pay much attention to her own children. Isn't this very shameful? Perhaps only such a shameful mother would give birth to such a shameful son like me. After saying this, Fan Xian coughed gently. Lin Wanner came down from his legs and pounded his back. Fan Xian waved his hand and smiled. That was close. Fortunately, there was still father. He pointed in the direction of the front yard and said, there was also grandmother, and those two strange old men. Otherwise, I don't know what would have happened to me in this life. Fan Xian had always been a very self-restrained and cautious person. He didn't have much time to be emotional like he was today. Lin Wanner had been unable to get a word in. Seeing that he was gradually moving away from only sighing, she simply smiled and looked at him, listening to his inner monologue. Listen to me sing a song, Fan Xian suddenly said very seriously. Lin Wanner nodded. She was a bit curious. What kind of song would a grown man sing? Fan Xian opened his lips and began to sing. His clear voice carried a bit of sadness. His voice was not good, but this song was particularly sad. In the sadness, there was also a bit of hope. It was like a child propping up his chin under the eaves after the rain, waiting for his mother's return. It was like a little figure of white cloth under the eaves being battered by the wind and rain, fluttering in the wind and rain. It was completely powerless, only held by that string. It was indescribably sad, yet it gazed into the distance. The song ended. What does that mean? Fan Xian was singing a language Lin Wanner had never heard of. The pronunciation of the words was a bit strange. The general meaning of the lyrics is very simple. It's probably, Mother, how are you? Yesterday I was on the branches of a fir tree. I saw a bright star. The star gazed at me just like Mother. Very gentle, I said to the star, must be able to withstand setbacks. Are you a boy? If you feel lonely I will come and talk maybe one day. Then so be it. Looking forward to your reply, Mother. One wristone rest, Mother. How are you? The kitten in the temple yesterday was taken away by the people of the nearby village. The kitten cried, tightly hugged the mother cat. I said it, don't cry, you won't be lonely. Are you a boy? You will see Mother again one day, certainly. Then so be it. Looking forward to your reply, Mother. One wristone rest. Fan Xian smiled and looked at Wan, whose eyes were already red. It sounds good, doesn't it? Yes. Wanner snorted and asked, is Ishio the child who wrote the letter? How pitiful. Yes, a very smart child who can't live with his mother, said Li Yundong. Fan Xian smiled and said, he's very similar to me, except that he can write a letter and mail it to an address. But if I write a letter, where can I send it? What's the name of this song? Mother. In the quiet bedroom, Fan Xian took out a key and gently opened the outermost layer of the long black chest. Then he used a steady finger to press it a few times. Suddenly he began to miss Wu Zhu. Slowly, he took out the metal instrument and the thin letter. Fan Xian didn't look at it, because he was already too familiar with the contents of the letter. He only stared at the third layer of paper, the piece of paper that looked like it could be blown away by the wind at any moment. On the paper was Yi Qingmei's straight handwriting. Hey, if it's Wu Zhu, tell me honestly, who are you? Just like that rainy night, Fan Xian's lips moved slightly. I'm your son. How did you open this chest? If it's not my daughter, then it's my son. You can look at what's below when you kill someone. Remember? He opened the third layer and took out the item from inside. Glancing at the words on it, he couldn't help but laugh bitterly. He said to himself, it really is an abortion drug. I say, Mother, Can't you be more creative with your pranks? He was silent in the room for a long time. Then he raised his head and with a confident smile, said seriously to the chest, "Mother, I've killed someone, but I won't use this thing. You're always used to treating everything as a joke, so in the end, you left me very laughably. But I'm different. I will work hard to survive in this world. As for my daughter or son, please believe me, I will take good care of them, at least, I will do better than you. Let me say this first, I sympathize with Wan. In the future things will get better. Believe me, some people guessed that they were going to open the third layer. At first, most people guessed that it was Durex and the emergency contraceptive pill. I can only say that everyone's imagination has surpassed my, or Xiao Yezi's talent for pranks. I am very impressed. Today's chapter has so many words, because I have always wanted to write a paragraph. What should I write? It's not Fan Xian's psychological shadow, but rather his feelings for Yi Qingmei. It's the kind of hidden bitterness that should arise when one is truly recognized as a son. Mother doesn't love me. I've put this note in the draft for over half a year. I've always wanted to write it. Today I finally wrote it. Very good. That song is my favorite song. It's the ending song of Ishio. It's by Fujita Shiko's mother. It can be searched on Baidu. Those who haven't heard it should listen to it. It's really good. This is also why I've always said that Fan Xian must sing it in the draft. The abortion pill was Yi Qingmei's original weapon, but Fan Xian's existence proved that she had never used it. Then she treated it as her most important inheritance in this world, and passed it on to her descendants. It was more important than the Overwatch Council and the palace treasury. From this, it can be seen that she loved her bastard of a son. Fan Xian must clearly understand this. These words and the song were not in the word count. The monthly votes were still in double. Although the second son's voice was not pleasant to hear, he was very handsome. He was indescribably happy. He asked everyone to continue to support him. He was very grateful. Chapter 489. For yesterday's chapter, I debated with the leader for over an hour. I'm so pitiful. I'm not Fan Xian, so how can I be innocent? The monthly votes went to third place. My peers behind me chased after me closely, saying seriously, I want to see if I can get into the top 3 this month. My votes will double in the next 7 days, so I'm constantly canvassing for votes. Brothers and sisters, if you have any on hand, just give them to me. The news of the Fan Manor having a joyous occasion was like it had grown a pair of wings, and immediately flew out. It flew past the tall walls of the manors of the nobles, and the vigilant eyes of the waiters in the tea-houses. It became news that everyone knew, the hot topic of discussion among the nobles in Jingdo, and the greatest joy of the common people after their meals were all gathered here. This news also flew into the royal palace, and entered the ears of the emperor and empress dowager, completely disregarding the obstruction of the majestic palace walls. According to eunuch Yao, the moment the Qing emperor heard of this news, he gently stroked his beard, and was very pleased. That night, he went to the little tower again. After the empress dowager learned of this news, she quickly went to the back of Hongguang Palace to worship. Her fingers endlessly stroked the string of rosary beads with a face full of smiles. Speaking of which, it was strange. Including Fan Xian, the Qing emperor had 5 princes. The third prince was still young, but the great prince was not young. He had been married for a long time, but he still did not have children. The second prince and the crown prince were the same. No matter how one looked at it, the child in Cece's stomach in the Fan Manor was the first of the third generation of the royal family. It was impossible for the nobles in the royal palace to be happy. However, the empress dowager faintly felt some regret. If only the pregnant woman was Chun girl. Putting aside whether or not she was a princess, Fan Xian's official wife was, after all, her favorite granddaughter. Given Fan Xian's present power and status, countless guests surged forth with gifts and congratulations. In the next few days, there was an endless stream of carriages in front of the Fan Manor in the south of the city. Officials from all walks of life came and went endlessly. Tung Zijing and his wife's legs were about to turn to jelly from running. Other than a few important figures, such as the people from King Jing's manor, who Fan Xian personally came out to greet. The other guests were all single-handedly blocked by the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian. Fortunately, these guests only gave him valuable gifts and did not disturb him for too long. The people in court and palace were actually calculating in their hearts. Although Fan Xian having a child was a major event, the one pregnant was his concubine. If they appeared overly enthusiastic at this time, who knew what the princess in the manor was thinking? Pleasing one side, but offending the other was not a good deal. Furthermore, these officials did not know just how happy the palace was. 3 days later, the joy in the palace was displayed in front of the Qing officials and people in 2 ways. First, it was the embroidered newspaper organized by the internal court that used red to report the good news to the people of the world. The internal court newspaper always told the jokes of jealousy between officials and the funny side of history. Although the story of Chen Pingping's first love was a bit boring and uninteresting, it was very eye-catching. However, ever since Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, he had made council affairs more open through rectification. He ordered the 8th Bureau to put up countless notices on the door of the 1st Bureau, turning the sinister process of official strife into a collection of stories about solving cases. Regardless of whether it was in a previous or current life, stories with pillows and fists always sold best. The internal court newspaper only had pillows and no fists, so all the glory was stolen by the notice board on the door of the 1st Bureau. Fortunately, Fan Xian had a son. The emperor silently allowed the internal court newspaper to publicize the matter. It wrote the story of Fan Xian coming from Danzhou to Jingdou in detail, into a long erotic story. It vaguely mentioned the princess, the saint girl of northern Qi, the past of the young mother of the Fan Manor, the night of poetry in the palace, and the past of Jiangnan. This was a summary of Fan Xian's rushed 20 years of life. It was very glorious. Once the newspaper came out, paper became expensive in Jingdou. The young ladies of each manor begged the elders of their families to spend a lot of money to buy a copy to put in their boudoir as a memento. At the same time, they prayed in their hearts that the faintly discernible temple would bestow upon them a man like Sir Fan Jr. The internal court newspaper finally used this opportunity to successfully conquer the Jingdou people in front of the notice board in the 1st Bureau. The second reaction of the palace's joy was rewards. No one knew whether it was the emperor's or the empress dowager's intentions, but the rewards from the palace flowed into the Fan Manor like water. Although the one with the child was Cece, from Fan Jian to Lady Lu to the young lady of the Fan family, who was far away studying in northern Qi, they all received great rewards. Fan Xian's official wife, Lin Wanner, received the greatest reward of all. Silks and satins, gold, stone, jade, food, and toys were all lined up densely in the manor. It made the wife of the Tang family so busy that she became absent-minded. She thought to herself that the young master had saved the emperor's life once, but it was not as great as the reward he received this time. Cece received a reward and was given a certain title. In any case, Fan Xian didn't understand this title. Even the unborn child in her stomach was given a title first. The newspaper and the rewards, one after another, made the joy of the people in the royal palace spread to every inch of Jingdou. The officials who had given gifts beforehand relaxed. Only Fan Xian was not very happy. He looked at the list of gifts eunuch Yao had brought, and shook his head. A complicated emotion rose in his heart. To his father beside him he said, "What are the people in the palace thinking? What does my child have to do with them?" "These are words said in a fit of pique," Fan Jian said with a smile. "I had thought you would mature a bit. Who would have thought that you would say such words in a fit of pique? What does it matter? What do you think it matters? In the 3rd generation this is the first. The Empress Dowager has been anxious for many years. Finally she can hold a great-grandchild. In her happiness, the rewards she gives exceed the norm." Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "Hold a great-grandchild? Tomorrow, I'll send Cece back to Danzhou. Born in Danzhou, raised in Danzhou, and let grandmother play with her." This was still in a fit of pique. Cece was pregnant. How could she travel thousands of li? Fan Xian laughed loudly, but couldn't be bothered to scold him. Ever since he learned of Cece's pregnancy 4 days ago, this usually serious and upright minister of revenue could not hide his true nature. From his face to his bones, a sense of pride and happiness seeped through him. In this world, there were not many people who could fight the emperor for a son and win. Furthermore, this son was about to give him a grandson. Fan Xian couldn't help but feel comforted and strangely proud. When you return to the palace tomorrow to give thanks, don't forget. Fan Xian took a sip of tea and glanced at his son. He found that it was clear that his son had not heard these words. Speaking of which, why has the crown prince never had a crown princess? Fan Xian suddenly thought of something and furrowed his brows. Even if it's in order, the great prince and second prince are both married. A year has passed. Is the palace not anxious about the crown prince's matter? His words were asked naturally, and cleverly concealed the probing in his words. Fan Xian was clearly so happy that he didn't realize his son was probing him. He furrowed his brows and said, as early as 3 years ago, the Empress Dowager was already anxiously planning the matter of the crown princess. The Empress was choosing people from various manors in Jingdo, and even picked our manor. Fan Xian shivered. He thought to himself that if his sister had truly become the crown princess, that would have been terrible. It was not that his sister would have been terrible, but he would have been terrible. Wouldn't he have immediately fallen to the crown prince's side and planned the matter of fighting for the throne with his brother? Fortunately, this matter did not happen. Fan Xian continued. However, for some reason, the crown prince never agreed. This can be considered a strange matter from back then. You know the crown prince. In his early years he was rather preposterous. He liked to hang out in the entertainment houses and brothels. He was originally a person with great interest in the matters between men and women, yet he refused to marry. Fan Xian thought for a bit, and then said, but the crown prince's marriage is not something he can refuse just because he doesn't want it. This shows how smart the crown prince is. Fan Jian smiled and said, to convince the Empress Dowager and Empress, the crown prince had thought a lot. First, he said that the great prince and the second prince were not married yet. The Qing kingdom governed the world with filial piety and paid particular attention to brotherly respect. As the younger brother, how could he rush to get married before his two brothers? At that time, the great prince was still fighting the Hu people in the West. It was impossible for him to arrange a marriage in such a short time. Although the reason is sufficient, it's not convincing. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, after all this, it turns out I'm the representative of those who marry early. It's natural to be the first to have a child. It's the same logic, but when it comes to the emperor's family matters, it naturally needs to be said by the mouth of a persuasive person. Fan Jian smiled. The crown prince invited the grand tutor of the crown prince, Shu the grand secretary. Shu the grand secretary was a stubborn man, and deeply believed that what the crown prince said was reasonable. Not only did he personally ask the emperor to postpone the crown prince's marriage, he even wrote to the north to ask Master Zhuang to speak. Fan Xian laughed. So Mr. Zhuang Mohan also did something like this in the past. Fan Jian suddenly saw the tiredness in his son's eyes. He sighed and said, did you not sleep well these past few days? Quickly go rest. Fan Xian smiled awkwardly and took his leave of the study. He had indeed not rested well these past few days. First of all, Cece was pregnant, so he had to be by her side at all times to comfort and be considerate. On the other side, although Warner did not appear to have anything on the surface, and was still happily managing Cece's little life, everyone knew that a girl's mood must be full of mixed emotions. Fan Si felt great heartache, and had to take out a lot of time to accompany and comfort her. He had to take care of both sides, so he didn't have much time to rest. In the corridor in front of the study, he stretched and yawned. He shook his head in distress. He suddenly thought of the truth of life he had once thought of a long time ago in the garden of his manor. For a man, marrying too early was always a stupid move. However, the crown prince's insistence on not marrying early was probably based on a very stupid idea. Fan Xian yawned and sighed in his heart. He couldn't tell that the crown prince was a lover. What an ill-fated relationship. Suddenly, he saw Lady Lu walk in with a warm smile and an old man. Fan Xian's gaping mouth couldn't close for a moment. He jumped up and yelled loudly, "You're finally here." The person who had come was not a guest. It was the teacher Fan Xian greatly respected, trusted and loved Fei Ti. However, teacher and student met for the first time in almost a year. Between the old and the young, there was hidden wind and thunder raging. The light of knives and the will of swords exploded. It was as if they could throw out a handful of poison for the other to taste at any moment. Lady Lu was an intelligent person. Although she didn't understand the reason, she could see that this was not a place to stay for long. She casually said a few words, and then left. She didn't even inform Minister Fan of the important news of Fei Jie's arrival. "Sir." Fan Xian looked at the strange color in Fei Jie's eyes with a not quite there smile and said, "You've been hiding from me for so many days. Why have you come today?" Fei Jie glanced at him unhappily and shook his head. "Don't think of anything good. I've tried the medicine and prescription you sent over many times. I don't think there's any problem at all. Basically, it's very difficult." Fan Xian shook his head in distress. He had thought that since Fei Jie was willing to come to the manor, he must have solved this problem. He didn't expect to hear an answer that wasn't so wonderful. All along, he hadn't cared too much about the problem of whether or not Wanner could have children. He didn't even consider whether or not he would have descendants. On the cliff in Danzhou, he told Uncle Wuzhu that one of his 3 goals was to have children wildly. But Wanner didn't think like this. She wanted a child too much, so Fan Xian could only become forced to be nervous. Teacher and student sat in a quiet corner of the garden in the back of the manor. A servant brought them tea and then retreated. When cousins marry, will it have any effect on descendants? Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then asked a question he hadn't asked in a long time. Fei Jie glanced at him and said in a raspy voice, "Do you think your luck will be that bad?" Fan Xian smiled and thought to himself that it was right. It was just a question of probability. Without question, he was the luckiest person in the world. Will it be more difficult to have children? Fan Xian suddenly furrowed his brows and asked, "Who said that?" Fei Jie understood that he was talking about blood relatives. Mockingly he said, 100 years ago, the Wei Emperor raped his own daughter for a dozen years. In the end, she gave birth to 7 children in a row. Of course, not many of the 7 children were normal. Fei Jie shrugged his shoulders. Chaotic. The royal family is indeed the most chaotic place in the world. Fan Xian sighed and said. Fei Jie furrowed his brows slightly. He didn't know if his disciple's words meant something. However, that matter had too many implications. In order to protect Fan Xian, he and Chen Pingping would not say anything to Fan Xian beforehand. "Why have you come today to teach me?" Fan Xian asked sincerely. Fei Jie thought for a bit, and then said, "The director guessed that your home is not peaceful, so he had me come to calm your heart." "Calm? Yes. Give me another half a year, and I might be able to solve the problem you and your wife are having headaches about." Fei Jie smiled slightly. "Then I must remind you of something. Your return date is almost here. Don't use Cece's pregnancy as an excuse to not go to Jiangnan." Looking at the palace's attitude, Fan Xian might be kept in Jingdou because of this matter. This was what Chen Pingping and Fei Jie were truly worried about. Fan Xian thought for a bit, and then nodded. He faintly sensed that Chen Pingping and Sir Fei did not want him to stay in Jingdou for too long. It seemed that they had also sensed that something big might happen in Jingdou. He finally couldn't resist. Fei Jie was his childhood teacher. In his opinion, he was the last person in the world to harm him. He hesitated for a moment and then said, "Is something going to happen in the palace?" Fei Jie smiled and said, "What could happen?" A glimmer of worry flashed through his eyes, but it was hidden from Fan Xian's eyes. He looked at Fan Xian's face, which was still as clean and untainted as it was a dozen years ago. Involuntarily, he thought of the time when he took Fan Xian to dig graves, admire corpses, and take out stomachs and intestines. His heart darkened slightly. He smiled gently and said, "In the future, when you're alone, you have to be careful. Don't be like when you were little, often tricked by others." Fan Xian was slightly startled. A strange emotion welled up in his heart. He hurriedly asked, "Sir, What do you mean by this? Fei Jie scratched his head and paid no attention to the flying dandruff. Nothing. It's just that I spend many years wandering in the mountains and am rarely by your side. The strange smoke ice medicine. I've never explained it to you. It was my fault. Fan Xian was very moved and quickly said, Sir, what are you saying? Without you, I don't know how many times we would have died. Fei Jie smiled and didn't say anything more. The next day, he entered the palace to give his thanks. Although Fan Xian was unwilling, he still piled a sincere and grateful smile on his face. He walked all over the palace, particularly in front of the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. He held out his grateful heart and smeared a layer of the confusion and excitement of being a father for the first time. His performance was brilliant. Along the way, there was no more snow in the Vermilion Palace. It was quiet and elegant. Fan Xian was sitting in the Eastern Palace, looking at the Crown Prince in front of him and talking casually. He looked at the Crown Prince of the Eastern Palace, wearing light yellow clothing, and his seemingly sincere face. Thinking of what would happen not long after, for some reason, he felt a sense of apology in his heart. The Crown Prince was urging him and his aunt, who was his mother-in-law, to ease their relationship. It could be seen that the Crown Prince was speaking sincerely. However, it was unknown whether he was considering the problem from Fan Xian's or the eldest princess's point of view. Let bygones be bygones. Just like I said to you in Baoyue Brothel, why should the matters of our elders affect our present? You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.